They cast out their king on a moonless night. No ceremony, no blade, just silence and a locked gate. But here's what nobody tells you about a man built for conquest. Exile doesn't break him, it reveals him. What happens when the most powerful alpha in the known empire is stripped of everything except the one thing they could never take? His will? Stay until the very end, because this story is going to hit you somewhere you didn't expect. Hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The night Draven Morvane rode out of Moonspire Palace for the last time, it was raining, the kind of rain that doesn't care about you. Not the dramatic kind from songs and murals. Not silver curtains parting over a hero's departure. Just cold, indifferent water falling from a black sky onto a man who had bled for every stone in that city's foundation, and who now rode away from it with nothing but a saddlebag, a wool cloak soaked through to the skin, and the particular silence of a man who has not yet decided whether to feel or to survive. He chose to survive. That was always the choice, with Draven. Survival first. Grief later. Maybe never. The road south from Moonspire's outer wall was unpaved past the 2nd-mile marker, something he had never noticed from a carriage. On horseback, in the dark, you felt every stone beneath the hooves, every divot, every place the earth had given way and not been tended to. The Empire had roads that could shame the old continent. Out here, past the last lamppost, there was just mud and trees and the distant sound of something moving through the forest that didn't want to be heard. His horse, a pale gray stallion named Ashen, who had carried him through 3 campaigns and never once flinched at cannon fire, moved with careful steps. Even the animal knew this was different. This was not an advance. This was a retreat wrapped in the costume of a choice. Draven had given it the costume himself. Packed his own bag. Left the crown on the council table. Not thrown, not abandoned, just set down, with his ring beside it, as if he were stepping away briefly and might return. He would not return. He had known that even as his hands arranged those objects with the careful dignity of a man who refuses to let witnesses see him crack. There had been witnesses, 4 of them. His High Council, who had passed the motion at dawn with 3 votes to 1, citing royal conduct unbecoming of the throne, citing the instability of an unmated king during border crisis, citing, and this was the part that had nearly split him open, the consensus of the noble houses that Moonspire required certainty, not sentiment. Sentiment. That was what they had called it. 22 years of service, 8 years of reign, 4 wars ended, 1 continent partially unified, and it collapsed into a single word spoken by men who had never once stood in a gap between 2 armies and refused to move. Sentiment. He did not argue the vote. That was perhaps the thing they had not expected. Lord Carver had prepared a rebuttal speech. Draven could see it in the way the man kept touching his breast pocket, fingers hovering over folded paper. Commander Sile had his jaw set like a man bracing for a storm. Even Harwick, who had cast the dissenting vote and could not meet anyone's eyes afterward, looked like he was prepared for the king to flip the table. Draven had stood up from his chair, looked at each of them for 3 full seconds apiece, and said, "You'll want a regent while you negotiate a successor. Don't let it be Carver. He's been skimming the grain tax for 7 months." Then he had walked out. He heard Carver start to object as the door swung shut. Let him object. Let them all scramble. He was done managing the feelings of men who had just exiled him. The rain came harder. Ashen shook his mane once, irritated, and kept moving. Draven pulled his cloak tighter and thought about where a deposed king goes when he has no intention of staging a comeback. No army waiting in some mountain fortress. No secret cache of loyalty to be called upon. He had those options. He knew it. 3 of his generals would answer a raven within 2 days. 2 border lords owed him debts that went deeper than politics. There were paths back to that throne that did not require asking permission. He was not going to take them. Not because he was beaten, not because he believed the council was right, but because a man who retakes power through force becomes something else, becomes the very thing he had spent his reign trying not to be. He had seen what rulers looked like after they clawed back a stolen throne. Something went hard in them, something that never softened again. Draven Morvane was many things. He was not willing to become that. The forest opened briefly into a stretch of open ground, and through the rain he saw, at a distance of perhaps 2 miles, a single amber light, low, warm, fixed. Not a campfire, too steady. A lantern over a door maybe, or a window with a lamp left burning. He had no map. He hadn't thought to take one. Somewhere to the south was the border territory. Somewhere in that direction was a neutral corridor that no faction claimed, where a man could theoretically breathe without someone measuring his next move. He turned ashen toward the light. That was all. No strategy. No plan. Just a light in the rain, and a man too tired for anything more complicated than moving toward warmth. The building resolved slowly from the dark. Stone. 2 stories. A covered stable to the east side. A sign above the door that he couldn't read at first, then could, Ravenmere Lodge. Below it, in smaller lettering that had been freshened with new paint recently, neutral ground, all travelers, fair price. He almost laughed. It came out as a breath, harsh and unplanned. Neutral ground. He hadn't stood on neutral ground in 8 years. He wasn't sure he remembered how. He tied Ashen under the stable's eave, gave the horse a cursory check, shoes intact, no heat in the legs, grain whenever that happened, and pushed open the lodge's front door. The warmth hit him like a physical thing, not aggressive heat, not the roar of an overstoked palace hearth trying to impress visiting dignitaries. Just steady, considered warmth that had been built and maintained by someone who understood the difference between a fire for show and a fire for living. 2 lamps on the main counter, a long table to the left with benches, 2 travelers at the far end eating in silence, a narrow staircase, stone walls hung with nothing decorative, just useful things, a coiled rope, an iron hook, a tallow candle on a shelf, and behind the counter, a woman. She looked up from a ledger the moment he entered, brown hair pulled back without ceremony, a work apron over dark clothes, eyes that did not widen at the sight of him, which was unusual. Most people's eyes widened, even slightly, even without knowing why. His physicality preceded his reputation in most rooms. She simply looked at him, assessed him the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood before deciding what it's good for, and said, "Storm caught you." "Yes." He pushed back his hood. Water ran off the edge of it onto the flagstone floor. "There's a peg for the cloak. Second from the left. First one's loose, it'll drop it on your boots." He used the second peg. The cloak hung there, dripping quietly. He turned back to her. "Room," he said. Then, because something in her stillness made him add it, "Please." She looked at him again, that same carpenter's look. "How many nights?" "Unknown. Unknown works here. Settle at the end of each week." She reached beneath the counter and produced a key on an iron ring. "Upper floor, last door, furthest from the road noise. Quietest room in the building." She named a price. It was the price of the cheapest room in the building, he would later learn, though she had given him the finest. He set coins on the counter without counting them. More than the price. She looked at the coins, looked at him, and slid 3 back toward his side without comment. "Supper's been cleared," she said, "but there's bread and cold meat if you want it. No charge for the first night's meal." "Why?" She blinked once. "Because you came in out of the rain and you look like you haven't eaten since yesterday morning." He had not. He hadn't noticed until she said it. Now his stomach announced itself with an authority that embarrassed him slightly. "Sit," she said, and nodded at the long table. He sat. She brought bread, meat, a wedge of hard cheese, and a cup of something hot that turned out to be brewed bark and herbs. Nothing fine about it, but it moved through him like a hand pressing a bruise away from the inside. He ate without speaking. She returned to her ledger. The 2 travelers at the far end finished their meal, bid her a quiet good night, and went upstairs. When Draven was finished, he carried his plate to the counter without being asked. She looked at the plate, then at him. A flicker of something crossed her face, not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He took his room key from the counter and went upstairs. He did not sleep for a long time. He lay on his back in the dark with the rain against the shutters and the unfamiliar quiet of a building that had never known him as anything. No one in this structure knew his name. No one was watching his breathing to read his next move. The mattress was firm, and the blanket smelled like cedar and something vaguely herbal. He stared at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in years, the precise dimensions of himself. Not a king, not a symbol, just a large man in a quiet room, taking up space, weighing something like 7 stone of failure that had not yet finished settling. He thought about the council vote. He went through it systematically, the way he always processed loss, methodically, without sentiment, the way you inventory a battlefield after. 3 votes. Carver, who had always resented the grain audit. Pembar, who had been Varessa's political ally for a decade, and whose loyalties were not subtle. Doran, the newest member, who voted whichever way the wind promised him safety. And Harwick. One dissenting vote from a man who had served Moonspire for 30 years, and who, in the end, could not carry the room alone. It wasn't the votes that had done it, it was the sequence. The sequence that had begun 6 months ago when Varessa Nightveil arrived with her silver banners and her devastating composure and her uncanny ability to make everything she touched feel like it had always been hers. He didn't want to think about Varessa. Not tonight. He thought about the innkeeper instead. The way she hadn't widened her eyes. The way she slid those 3 coins back without commentary, as if his dignity was a self-evident thing she saw no reason to bruise. He hadn't been treated without ceremony in so long that the experience of it felt strange. Uncomfortable, even. Like a muscle you discover has been braced for years that someone has finally asked to unclench. Sleep came eventually. It wasn't restful. But it was sleep. I was up before dawn. Old habit. The body doesn't forget schedule just because context has collapsed. He dressed in the same clothes. He'd need to acquire others. His entire wardrobe was in a palace he no longer had access to, and went downstairs. She was already there. A fire built, the ledger put away, a pot over the flame. She wore different clothes, but the same apron and the same expression of someone mid-task who does not require an audience. She heard him on the stairs and spoke without looking up. Coffee or the bark brew? What's the difference? Coffee is real. The bark brew is what I drink when I need to think clearly without getting sharp. He considered that. Coffee. She poured 2 cups. Set one on the counter nearest him without approaching with it, as if she understood that a man like him preferred to close the distance himself rather than have things handed to him. He came to the counter and took it. She drank hers and looked at the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. Pre-dawn gray sat against the glass. "You're not a merchant," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Military?" "Adjacent." She made a sound, not skepticism exactly, more like filing something away. "My father had a rule," she said. "Don't ask what a man was before he walked through the door. What matters is what he is in the room." "Smart man. Practical man." A pause. "He's gone. This is mine now." Draven looked around the lodge. The intentional maintenance of it. The clean floor, the straightened curtain, the peg that had been rehung to prevent it dropping cloaks on boots. "You run it alone?" "Mostly. Keth helps with the stable and the heavy hauling. Girl named Mira comes 3 days a week for rooms." She drank. "It's enough." "Is it?" She looked at him then, direct. The kind of look that doesn't apologize for itself. "That's a strange question from a man I met last night. He met it. I mean no offense. I'm trying to understand the arithmetic of this place." "The arithmetic is none of your business." "Fair." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that. "What do I call you?" "Draven." "Ceres." She set down her cup. "You'll want breakfast in an hour. I do eggs when I have them. We have them today." That was how the first morning went. The days that followed had a rhythm. Draven had not felt since childhood, since before service, before campaigns, before the suffocating formality of court. He woke. He drank coffee at the counter with a woman who spoke when she had something to say and was quiet when she didn't. He helped, unbidden, with things that needed doing. A hearthstone in the common room had cracked, and he repaired it with mortar he found in the stable. A support beam in the stable ceiling had worked loose at one end, and he braced it without being asked and without announcing he had done it. Ceres noticed. She said nothing directly, but the next morning there was a second cup of coffee waiting on the counter before he reached the bottom of the stairs. And she didn't look up from her work when he took it. He did not tell her who he was. Not yet. Not deliberately withheld, more that it hadn't come up, and he found that he did not want to introduce it. The moment he said king, exiled king, Silverfang, Moonspire, whatever phrasing he used, it would land between them and change the architecture of how she looked at him. He had had exactly one person in recent memory look at him without that architecture in place. He was not ready to dismantle it. On the 4th day, a pair of southern traders arrived, and over supper their conversation drifted to Moonspire. Draven sat at the far end of the table with his cup and listened. "Word from the capital," the shorter trader said to his companion. King's gone, council's in session, no announcement yet on succession. King's gone, the other repeated, testing it. Voluntary or removed? Both, by the sound of it. Depends who you ask in that city. Saris was clearing plates at the near end of the table. Her hands continued their work without pause. She did not look at Draven. He looked at his cup. What's Silver Fang gonna do, you figure? The taller trader asked. Man like that doesn't just disappear. Man like that might, the shorter one said. Sometimes the ones who built it all get the most tired of carrying it. Draven set his cup down, carefully. He looked up and found Saris already looking at him from 3 feet away, plates in hand. Her face gave him nothing. No alarm, no recognition registering in real time. Just that steady, even regard. Then she turned and carried the plates to the kitchen. He stayed where he was for another hour. The traders finished their meal and retired. The fire burned down. He stood, finally, and went to the kitchen doorway. She was washing plates in a basin. She heard him behind her and did not turn around. Saris. I heard what they said. A beat. I didn't lie to you, he said. I didn't ask. She set a plate on the dry rack. I told you my father's rule on the first morning. He was quiet for a moment. That's generous. It's practical. She picked up the next plate. A man running from something is either a coward or he's thinking. You've been thinking. The work you've done on this building in 4 days cost me nothing and needed doing. She set that plate down too. I'm not in the business of chasing a man out for not volunteering his history. I'm Draven Morvane, he said, as if she might not have understood who the traders were describing. I know who Draven Morvane is. She still didn't turn around. I've known since the first morning, when you came down before dawn and your posture was so trained it looked like it cost you effort to stand any other way. Finally she turned, dried her hands on the apron, looked at him with that same direct, undecorated regard. What I don't know is what you need while you're here. So tell me that, and we'll be square. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his chest did something unfamiliar. Not painful, exactly, but significant. Like a compass needle swinging toward north after years of interference. I don't know yet, he admitted. All right, she said. When you figure it out, let me know. She hung the apron on its hook. Get some sleep. You look like you've been running a war in your head since you walked in. He had been. He went upstairs. He slept for the first time without event. The days continued. Something shifted in the quality of them. Still functional, still defined by work, and quiet, but with a new texture. Like a frequency that had been slightly off finally tuning into itself. He found himself staying later at the counter in the evenings. She did not encourage or discourage this. She simply continued being present in the way she was present, thoroughly, without performance. One evening, she asked him about the eastern border conflict he had been managing at the time of his removal. She asked with the same directness she asked everything, not curious in the breathless courtly way, not angling for information to use. Just a person who had thought about a thing and wanted to understand it better, he told her, more than he intended to. He talked about the 2 generations of resource competition, the failed arbitration under the previous administration, the specific strategic problem that the council had been using as the pretext for the Veressa proposal. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The solution they were proposing, she said, the renewed mating alliance. What did that actually solve? Veressa's faction controls the southern trade routes. The eastern lords need those routes to remain viable. An imperial connection to Nightville would theoretically give them leverage. Theoretically. She turned her cup in her hands. And practically? Practically. It handed the eastern lords security to a third party with her own interests. And gave her a seat inside the empire. Yes. And your council didn't see that. My council, he said carefully, was not looking at the same board I was looking at. Saris looked at him. Or they were, and they didn't mind. The air in the room changed. He had thought it. He had not said it, even to himself in exact language. Hearing it said plainly by someone with nothing to gain from saying it was like having a lamp held up in a room he'd been navigating by memory. That's a very blunt thing to say, he said. You don't need me to be careful with it. You've already thought it. She stood and took her cup to the basin. The only question is what you're going to do with the thought. He didn't have an answer for her that night, but he stopped pretending he didn't have the thought. It was on the 9th day that the ravens arrived, 3 of them, palace birds with the Moonspire cipher on their bands, landing at the lodge's window ledge with the particular purposeful quality of trained messages that have found their target. Draven stood at the window and looked at them for a moment. Then he untied the first message. It was from Harwick. Brief. The council is moving toward a formal declaration. Varessa arrives within the fortnight for the reopening of the alliance negotiations. I cannot stop this alone. I am asking you to consider your options. He sat down on the edge of his bed and read it 3 times. Then he untied the second message. This one was from Commander Sael. Not political, military. The eastern border skirmishes had escalated. 2 garrison posts overrun, not enough to constitute full war, but enough to create pressure. The kind of pressure that would make a desperate solution feel like a relief. The third message had no cipher he recognized. He unfolded it and found 4 lines in a handwriting too precise to be anything but trained. He has your rooms prepared. Saris Vale knows the southern corridor better than any border map. Let her show you. There are things she knows about Ravenmere that you need to hear before Varessa arrives. A friend of what was. He read the third message twice and then burned it in the lamp flame without knowing exactly why, except that unnamed advice felt like a snare, and he had not survived this long by walking into things he couldn't see the bottom of. But the name sat in him. Saris Vale knows the southern corridor. He went downstairs. She was at the counter. He put Harwick's message in front of her without preamble. She read it, set it down. How long do you have before she arrives? 12 days? Maybe 14 if the road south is as bad as the one I came in on. It's worse. She looked at the message again. The southern corridor through the ridge. There are 3 passes. 2 of them are traditional transit routes. The third hasn't been used officially in 30 years because it's not on any current Imperial map. It comes out inside Moonspire's eastern territory, behind the garrison line. She met his eyes. Someone who wanted to move men without being seen would use the third pass. He went still. How do you know that? Because my mother mapped it, she said. She was a boundary surveyor for the Neutral Corridor Commission when they established this territory. She gave me her records when she died. A pause. I have never offered that information to anyone. I'm offering it to you because I think you may need it, and I think you will use it correctly. Why do you trust that? She looked at him for a long, even moment. Because a man who repairs other people's hearthstones without being asked, and returns 3 coins that weren't his to keep, is a man who understands the difference between what he's owed and what he's responsible for. She straightened. Don't make me regret it. He said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at her in the way people very rarely look at one another. Not performing looking, not arranging their expression for effect, but actually letting the full weight of what's being seen land. I won't, he said. She nodded once and put the message in the lamp flame. They watched it burn. Over the next 3 days, he studied her mother's survey maps at the counter in the evenings, spreading the careful parchment under the lamp while she worked nearby, and answered his questions about terrain and elevation and the seasonal behavior of the ridgeline weather. She knew the land the way people know a thing they grew up in. Not academically, but in the body. The way a sailor knows the water without consulting navigation tables. He found himself watching her hands when she traced a route on the map. The careful economy of the gesture. Nothing wasted. You were a Luna, he said on the 3rd evening. Not a question. He had put it together from small things, the particular way she moved through a room, the pack-level attentiveness she had to everything around her, the scar on the side of her neck that wasn't quite hidden by her collar. She didn't tense. Long disconnected. What happened? She was quiet for a moment. My pack collapsed. Not in a battle. Just slowly, the way things do when the center doesn't hold. People left one at a time until there was no pack to be part of. She rolled the map edge with careful precision. I stayed. Not because I expected it to recover, because this place needed running and I knew how. You built it alone. I maintained it. It was already built. She looked at the wall, then back at the map. Building would have been something. What you've done here is not nothing. I didn't say it was nothing. Her eyes came up to his. I said it would have been something to build. He understood the distinction. He had spent years maintaining an empire built before him, and the difference between that and originating it was something he had felt but never named so cleanly. You could have gone somewhere else, he said. Joined another pack, started over. Yes. No hesitation. I could have. She didn't explain further. He didn't push. But that night, lying in the quiet of the room she'd given him, he thought about the particular stubbornness of a person who chooses to remain in a diminished place rather than abandon it, not from inability to leave, not from fear, but from some refusal to call the thing they built meaningless by walking away from it. He recognized that refusal. He had felt it himself on the morning the vote was counted. He had not stayed. He wondered if that made him the stronger or the weaker of the two of them. On the 12th day, a rider came through. Moonspire livery, traveling fast, barely stopped. He handed Saris a sealed dispatch at the door and was gone again in under 2 minutes. She brought it to Draven at the table where he was eating breakfast. He looked at the seal. Varessa's personal cipher. Not the Imperial Diplomatic Standard. Varessa's personal seal. On a courier heading south through the neutral corridor, he broke it and read. Draven, it began, as if they were still intimate, as if the last 2 years had not happened, as if the exiled king at an innkeeper's table was still a man she could address without ceremony. The negotiations will proceed with or without your cooperation. The alliance is the rational solution to the Eastern crisis, and the Council has already agreed in principle. What I am offering you now is not reconciliation, it is efficiency. Come to Moonspire. Take your place at the table. Let us end this quietly, for the Empire's sake, and everyone can maintain their dignity. He read to the end. There was nothing in the letter about what had passed between them. Nothing about what he had walked away from and why. Nothing about the months of watching her move through his court like someone measuring it for furniture. Just efficiency. Just dignity. Just the Empire. He folded the letter. Saris was at the counter, deliberately not watching him. She's already inside the council, he said. Saris turned. This was sent under her personal seal, not the diplomatic standard. That means she's not operating as a negotiating party anymore. He set the letter on the table. She's operating as someone who already has a seat. Saris crossed the room and read the letter. He watched her face as she did it. The careful control she kept of her expression, and underneath it, something colder and more precise than he expected. She's moving ahead of schedule, Saris said. Yes, which means whatever she was waiting for, she's gotten it. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at the road. The gray morning, the empty corridor south. He had told himself he was done with the throne. He had believed it, or believed something adjacent to it. That he was done with what the throne had cost him, done with the weight of men who voted the way safety promised them. But standing at this window, reading a letter from a woman who was in the process of taking everything he had built and wearing it like a coat, he felt something he had not felt since the night of his exile. Not anger. Anger was easy. Anger was a fire you could bank and walk away from. This was colder. This was a reckoning walking toward him with its name already spoken. He turned back from the window, and that was when he heard the horses. Not one, not two. A company. The particular drum of organized cavalry approaching from the north, and Saris was already at the window on the other side, her face completely still, and she said in a very quiet voice, "Those are Night Vale colors." Draven moved to her side. Through the window, down the road that had been empty 30 seconds ago, came a column of riders in silver and black. Perhaps 20. Ahead of them, in a carriage that bore Varessa's personal standard, something bright moved behind glass. She didn't come to negotiate, Saris said. No, he said. She came to collect. She turned from the window and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not fear, not quite, but something in that province. Something that recognized the shape of danger arriving uninvited on a road that was supposed to be neutral ground. Draven, she said. I know. They're going to knock on that door in 3 minutes. I know. She grabbed his arm. Not aggressive, just direct, immediate. The grip of someone who needs to know they've been heard. Whatever happens in the next hour, remember that this is my lodge. My name is on that sign. This is neutral ground, and she knows it. And if she violates it, she answers to every neutral corridor commission from here to the Southern Sea. Her eyes were steady. I will not be a stage for her performance. He looked down at the hand on his arm, then up at her face. He had stood across from monarchs, generals, warlords, negotiators trained from birth to present unreadable fronts. In his experience, the truly unshakable people were never performing their steadiness. They simply were steady, the way a bearing wall is steady. Because the structure of them was built for it. Saris Vale was built for it. She won't know what to do with you, he said quietly, and he meant it as plainly as he had said anything in years. The knock came, 3 measured strikes against the iron door. The kind of knock that is not asking permission, the kind that announces itself as already arrived. Saris let go of his arm. She smoothed her apron. She walked to the door, and standing in the cold morning light at the threshold of Ravenmere Lodge, looking past Saris' veil as if she were furniture, was Veressa Nightveil, silver-haired, silver-eyed, dressed in full ceremonial authority as though she had come to hold court rather than request lodging, and her gaze moved with practiced inevitability from the door to the room beyond, and landed on Draven with the particular expression of a woman who had calculated precisely where he would be and is gratified to find the calculation correct. "Draven," she said. Her voice was musical and lethal in the same breath. "I thought it might be time we spoke without a table between us." She began to step forward. Saris did not move. She did not step aside. She did not incline her head. She simply stood in the doorway with her hand still on the edge of the door, and in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and contained a spine of cold iron, said, "Ravenmere Lodge is neutral ground under the Corridor Commission Charter. I'll need your reason for arrival and whether you require accommodation before I can admit a company of that size." Veressa stopped. She looked at Saris, really looked at her for the first time, with the expression of a person who had not expected the furniture to speak. And in that single moment, something shifted in the geometry of the morning that would not shift back. What Veressa Nightveil would say next would change the course of 3 lives, and none of them would see it coming. Veressa Nightveil had spent 20 years learning how rooms worked, not rooms in the physical sense, though she understood those too, the way light fell through a window at a specific hour, the way a throne positioned 2 inches higher than the supplicant's chair altered the biochemistry of deference. She understood rooms the way a predator understands terrain, where the exits were, where the shadows pooled, where a person would instinctively move when pressure came from the left. She had not calculated for Saris Vale. That was the first miscalculation she had made in a long time, and the fact that it was a small one, a woman in a doorway, an innkeeper with her hand on a door, did not make it less significant. Small miscalculations were the ones that unraveled large plans. She had watched it happen to better strategists than herself. She smiled, not warmly. Veressa's warmth was always architectural, placed precisely where it would do the most structural work. "I'm not requesting accommodation," she said, addressing Saris with the careful pleasantness of someone speaking to a child who has asked an adult question. "I'm here on imperial diplomatic business. I believe you'll find the Corridor Commission Charter includes a provision for diplomatic transit of—" "Article 9, Saris said. "Diplomatic transit of up to 4 persons without prior notice. You've brought 21. She had counted. Draven, watching from 6 feet behind her, noted that she had counted without appearing to count. "For a company that size, I need 24 hours' notice and a stated purpose filed with the commission registry." Veressa's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes recalculated. "I see you know your charter." "It's my ground." The 2 words sat in the air between them with a weight that was entirely out of proportion to their size. Veressa shifted her attention past Saris to Draven. The smile warmed by exactly 1 degree, a precise adjustment, like turning a lamp dial. "Draven, it's been too long to be standing in doorways." "You know where the door is?" Draven said. "You knocked on it." A pause. Veressa tilted her head slightly, the gesture of a woman deciding how much patience to deploy. "I came in good faith. I thought we might speak privately before—" "She stays," Draven said. Veressa's eyes moved back to Saris. Really moved to her this time. Not the dismissive glance of before, but the focused assessment of a woman taking actual measure. She looked at the apron, the work-roughened hands, the absolute lack of ornamentation. Then she looked at the way Draven had said she stays, not protective, not possessive in the obvious way, but with the weight of someone stating a structural fact about the room. Something moved through Veressa's expression that she managed to close before it fully formed. "Of course," she said. She stepped inside. Saris moved aside, not retreating, just creating passage, the way water moves around stone, and closed the door. The morning light narrowed and then disappeared. Veressa's 2 personal guards stationed themselves inside the entrance. Saris looked at them, then at Veressa. Your men wait outside. They are my personal security. This is neutral ground, no armed escort inside the lodge. Saris met the nearest guard's eyes. Not aggressive, simply factual, the way a person states a law of physics. There's a covered area at the east stable. Keth will see to your horses. Varessa held for 3 seconds. Draven counted, then made a small gesture. The guard stepped back out. The door closed again. Now it was 3 of them in the common room, and the particular silence of a space that has been altered by the introduction of someone who changes the temperature without touching the fire. Here is what most people miss about power and presence. The truly dangerous individuals do not announce themselves with volume. Varessa Nightville did not need to raise her voice because she had spent decades ensuring that the silence around her said everything necessary. She crossed the common room with the ease of someone navigating her own palace and chose, without being invited, without asking, the chair nearest the hearth. Draven remained standing. Saris went to the counter. Varessa watched this small geography with the attention of someone reading a map. The eastern situation has deteriorated faster than the council's models projected, she said. She removed her riding gloves 1 finger at a time. 3 garrisons compromised. Supply lines to the northeastern territory are 70% interrupted. The border lords are— I know what the border lords are doing, Draven said. I managed their concerns for 8 years. And now you're not managing them. She set the gloves on the table beside her. Which is precisely why I'm here. You're here because the council gave you a timeline, and you're ahead of it. Her chin lifted by a fraction. I'm here because an empire doesn't pause for personal grievances. No, he said. It just reassigns them. The silence that followed was taut. Varessa looked at him with an expression that might have been mistaken for patience. It was not patience. It was the look of a person who has decided to let a smaller piece fall in order to protect a larger one. You were always direct, she said, and managed to make it sound like a diagnosis rather than a compliment. And you were always efficient. He pulled out a chair and sat down, forearms on the table. Not aggressive in posture, just present, grounded, the way he sat in every difficult meeting, because a man who shows discomfort through his body gives the room information he cannot take back. So let's be both. What do you actually want from this conversation? Varessa looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Saris. Could we have some privacy? No, Draven said. Saris said nothing. She was polishing the counter with a cloth that had probably been dry for some time, moving it in slow circles, her back half turned, occupying her own space without leaving it. This is the thing about a person who has been quietly present in enough rooms. They become invisible not through absence but through familiarity. You stop tracking them. You begin to speak as if they are furniture. Varessa made that mistake. She turned fully toward Draven and dropped the performance by exactly 1 layer. Not all the way, never all the way, with Varessa, but enough. The alliance will happen, she said. The council has already agreed in structure. What hasn't been determined is your role afterward. She paused to let that land. You could return to Moonspire with your dignity intact. You could sit at that table as a co-architect rather than a removed predecessor. That is not a small thing I'm offering you. Draven looked at her steadily. And what does it cost? Your cooperation with the transition process. Your public endorsement of the renewed alliance. Your absence from the eastern border negotiations specifically. That territory needs to be managed by the new structure without the ambiguity of 2 authorities. He repeated 1 word back to her. Endorsement. Yes. You want me to tell the Empire that removing me was correct. I want you to tell the Empire that you support its stability. That's the same sentence with different furniture. Varessa's jaw shifted slightly, the first physical tell she had given. Draven, you are a man without a court, without a commission, without legal standing in the territory you're currently sitting in. I am offering you a place at the table that the council would not have offered. Because you need something from me that the council can't give you. A beat. What is it? He said. Not a question, a demand shaped like a question. This is where most people, confronted with Draven Morvane's particular quality of attention, would either deflect or capitulate. Varessa Nightville was not most people. She reached into her coat and produced a folded document, setting it on the table between them with the precise deliberateness of a chess player placing a piece. The Eastern Border Lords will not submit to a Nightvale-aligned authority without a transitional figure they recognize. They know your face. They know your name. The military command structure runs on relationships you built. She tapped the document. A 6-month transitional co-regency. Then a formal handover. You remain in Moonspire, you retain your apartments, you retain your title and ceremony. He looked at the document without touching it. And Varessa Nightvale becomes what exactly at the end of 6 months? She held his gaze. The Empire survives. It was not an answer to the question he had asked. They both knew it, and this is the moment worth examining, worth pausing the story to sit inside, because it reveals something that rulers rarely admit and analysts rarely write down plainly. Draven Morvane was not surprised by what was on that document. He had read the shape of this offer in the letter that arrived that morning, in the direction of 21 riders from the north, in the particular way Varessa had said his name when the door opened, as if she were naming something she had already catalogued as hers. What surprised him was the feeling that came alongside the recognition. Not rage, not grief. Something older and quieter than either. A man can be betrayed by an enemy and call it war. He can be betrayed by a stranger and call it risk. But when he is betrayed by someone who has walked through the rooms of his actual life, who has sat at his table and used his name with familiarity and moved through his world as though she had a right to its corners, the wound does not announce itself cleanly. It seeps. It finds the places where trust left itself open and fills them with something cold that has no name in any formal language. Draven had spent 8 years trusting the architecture of his own perception. He was good at people. He was known for it. The Silver Fang, who negotiated as readily as he fought, who could read a room the way some men read weather. And he had not read Varessa, not fully. He had read her ambition and called it drive. He had read her political precision and called it intelligence. He had seen the way she mapped every room she entered and told himself it was simply the habit of a woman who had survived a difficult court. It was not habit, it was hunger. And he had mistaken it for something else because it was dressed in things he recognized. That sitting at this table on a gray morning with a document between them he would not touch was the thing he was actually reckoning with, not her, himself. "I'm not going to sign that," he said. Varessa did not react immediately. The composed woman across from him absorbed the refusal with the practiced ease of someone who anticipated it and had already arranged the next move. "Draven, I'm not going to stand beside you and tell 4 Eastern territories that the man who managed their security concerns for a decade endorses the arrangement that removed him." He pushed the document back across the table. "Not because I'm angry, because it would be a lie, and you are building on a foundation of several lies already, and I will not add mine to the structure." Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. "That is a significant accusation." "Which part?" "Several lies." Her voice had cooled by a precise degree. "Be specific." He leaned forward. "The Eastern crisis is not as acute as you've presented to the Council. I've seen the garrison reports. The 2 overrun posts were undermanned as a result of a reallocation order that passed through Pembar's desk 3 months ago. Pembar, who has been your political ally for a decade." He held her gaze. "Someone created the crisis that is now being used to justify the solution." The room was very quiet. From behind the counter, Saris had stopped moving the cloth. Varessa looked at Draven for a long moment. Her expression did not break, but around the edges of it something shifted, the way ice looks just before it accepts that it's going to crack. "You have no proof of that?" "Not yet." "Then you have a theory." "I have a pattern." He stood up from the table. "Varessa, I have known you for 14 years. I know how you move through a problem. I know that you do not arrive ahead of schedule without reason, and I know that you do not make this kind of offer unless refusing it has a consequence you've already planned for." He looked at her steadily. "What happens if I say no and you leave without the signature?" She picked up her gloves from the table. The act of picking them up was its own answer. A person who has alternate plans does not panic when the first one is declined. They simply move to the next position with the same composed efficiency. "Then the Council proceeds without your endorsement," she said, "which is less elegant but functional." She stood. "I had hoped, for the sake of what we built together, that this could happen with your cooperation." "What we built together," he said quietly. "Yes, we didn't build the same thing." He held her gaze. "I found that out gradually. I'm sorry it took me as long as it did." Something moved through Varessa's face then. Something genuine almost, the way a real emotion surfaces briefly through constructed ones before being managed back under. She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, And for one strange second, she was not the architect of a calculated takeover, but simply a woman across a room from a man who had once known her well enough to notice the difference. Then it was gone. "You were always the better fighter," she said. "I was always the better planner." She pulled one glove on, then the other. "We'll see which matters more at the end." She walked to the door, and then she stopped. She did not turn around fully. She turned just enough. The profile of her, silver hair over one shoulder, the clean line of ceremony and calculation dressed as a person. She spoke to the room generally, but the words were aimed with precision at Ceres. "The lodge is charming," she said. "These border sanctuaries always are. There's something almost noble about the people who tend them, keeping the fire lit for whoever passes through." A pause that lasted exactly one beat too long. "Whoever passes through." She opened the door and walked out into the morning. The door swung closed behind her, the sound of hooves and movement outside as the company regrouped. Then, gradually, the sound diminishing north. Then nothing but the fire and the quiet of the room. Ceres set down the cloth. Draven stood at the table with his hands at his sides and his jaw set and did not speak for a long moment. "She counted the coins," Ceres said. He turned. "What?" The way she looked at this place. At me. She came around the counter slowly. She wasn't seeing a lodge, she was making a calculation. Whoever passes through. Her voice was flat, factual. "She thinks you're temporary to yourself. That you'll go back to what she's offering because it's the version of your life that has weight to it." He looked at her. "Is she right?" Ceres asked. Not unkind, not soft about it, just the direct question of a person who needs accurate information before deciding what to carry. "No," he said. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, measuring it. Then she nodded once and turned back to the counter. He picked up the document Veressa had left and held it in his hands. Heavy paper. Formal seal. Language that had been crafted by someone who knew how to make a cage read like an invitation. He carried it to the fire and set the corner to the flame. He watched it burn completely. That evening, Harwick arrived. Alone. No livery. A horse that had been ridden harder than it should have been. A man who had slept less than he needed in more than a week. He knocked at the door with the particular knock of someone who has decided to do something and is moving before their nerve fails them. Ceres let him in. He was 63, barrel-shouldered, with a face that had been weathered by decades of council chambers, and the specific lines a man develops when he has voted against himself and lived with it. He saw Draven at the table and stopped in the doorway for a moment with the expression of someone who has found what they were looking for and is not entirely sure it's a relief. "You burned the document," he said. Not a question. Veressa's men would have reported back. "Yes." Harwick came in, sat down heavily. Ceres set a cup in front of him without being asked, and he wrapped both hands around it as if warmth were something he had been short of for a while. "She's moved her timeline," he said. "The council convenes in 7 days. She has the votes for a formal structural amendment. That's what she's really after, not just the alliance. She wants to change the succession framework itself. Remove the existing bloodline provisions." He looked at Draven. "If that amendment passes, the throne goes to whoever the new framework designates, and she controls the designation." Draven sat back. "Who's the 4th vote?" "Doran." "What did she offer him?" "His nephew gets a garrison command in the northeast." "The northeast that was deliberately undermanned." Harwick's eyes sharpened. "You know about the reallocation." "I reasoned it. Do you have documentation?" "I have Pembar's original order and a communication from Veressa's office that preceded it by 11 days. He pulled a folded set of papers from inside his coat and set them on the table between them. "I've been holding these for 6 weeks. I didn't know what to do with them." Draven unfolded the papers. He read them without speaking. His face did not change while he read, because it was a discipline he had developed early. The ability to receive terrible information without letting it alter your external presentation, because a room that sees you react to what you're reading will read your reaction before you've finished processing the content. He read to the end. He set the papers down. "She created the crisis," he said, flat, certain. "Yes, and the council doesn't know. Carver might. Pembar definitely does. Doran doesn't care." Harwick drank from his cup. "The other 3 members brought in after your removal. They're reading what they're given." Draven looked at the papers again. The cold precision of what was laid out in front of him, the manufactured instability, the strategic undermanning, the way an empire's eastern wound had been opened deliberately to make a specific solution feel inevitable, the lives that had been endangered, the garrison soldiers who had been left exposed not by enemy aggression, but by a calculated withdrawal designed to create pressure. This is where the philosophy of power becomes its most brutal and its most honest. Every ruler who has ever held a throne has understood on some level that the throne is not a chair. It is a problem. It is the problem of deciding whose interest the structure serves and what you are willing to do and willing to allow to maintain the structure's continuity. Varessa Nightville had made her decision about that problem with perfect clarity. She had decided the empire was a mechanism to be managed toward an outcome she had defined, and the people inside it were variables to be adjusted accordingly. Draven had never been able to make that decision. It had been called weakness by people who measured power in the number of things a ruler was willing to sacrifice. He had not disagreed with them in the way they expected. He had simply operated from a different calculation, that a ruler who treats people as variables eventually produces an empire full of people who treat the ruler the same way. He had been right. I was sitting in a neutral corridor lodge with documentation of a manufactured crisis because the woman who treated him as a variable had finally finished her calculation. Being right was cold comfort, but it was still information, and information held correctly was still leverage. "How long can you stay?" Draven asked Harwick. 2 days at most before my absence registers. Ceres. He turned to where she stood at the counter. She met his eyes. "I need to use your maps," he said. She reached below the counter without hesitation and produced the rolled survey documents her mother had made. She carried them to the table and spread them out, weighing the corners with a cup and a candlestick and the back of her own hand. She looked at the third pass, the one not on any current imperial chart, and then at Draven. "If you move fast," she said, "you're inside the Eastern Territory before her advance riders know the direction you came from." Harwick looked at the map, then at Ceres, then at Draven, with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. "Someone who knows this ground," Draven said. Ceres did not look up from the map. "The Commission Registry Office in the Eastern Corridor keeps a duplicate of my mother's survey records. Sealed. They haven't been accessed in 30 years. She traced the third pass with one finger. "But they're there. If you need them authenticated, the registrar in the Eastern office is a woman named Delwyn. She trained under my mother. She'll know what she's looking at." Harwick looked at the map for a long moment. "You're talking about a countermove," he said. "Inside 7 days. With no court, no commission, no formal standing." "I have standing with the Eastern Border Lords," Draven said. "I have your documentation, and I have a route she doesn't know exists. She'll know you're moving. She has eyes on this road." "Then we don't use this road." Harwick sat back. He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who has been carrying too much for too long and is now being asked to carry more. "If this fails," he said, "you're not just exiled. You're a destabilizing actor attempting to subvert a council-approved restructuring. The legal exposure, I know. And you're prepared for that." Draven looked at the map, at the third pass, at the route that existed because a surveyor had done honest work 30 years ago and her daughter had kept the record. "I'm prepared to stop pretending the cost of doing nothing is lower than the cost of acting," he said. "The garrison soldiers on that eastern border are exposed because someone calculated they were an acceptable loss. They are not an acceptable loss." He looked at Harwick. "That is my standing. Everything else is paperwork." Harwick was quiet for a moment. Then he drank the rest of his cup, set it down, straightened his back with the deliberate effort of a man deciding to hold more weight. "I'll need to return to the capital by the southern road," he said. "Visible, normal timeline, so her eyes report nothing unusual." He paused. "When do you move?" "Tomorrow night." Harwick nodded. He looked at the map one more time, then at Ceres. "Thank you for the fire," he said quietly, "and for the ground." She acknowledged it with a nod that was brief and complete. He stood. He shook Draven's hand. Not the formal grip of council chambers, but the grip of two men who understand they may not see each other in better circumstances again, and hold the hand accordingly. Then he left. The lodge settled back into its quiet. The fire. The map spread on the table. Draven sat with his hands flat on the parchment and looked at the route drawn by a dead woman's careful hand. Tomorrow night. a hard ride through terrain that hadn't been formally traveled in a generation. The eastern border lords who either remembered him clearly enough to receive him or had moved on in the way men move on when the figure they associated with a version of the world is no longer visible. He did not know which way that would fall. He had done harder things with worse odds. What he had not done, and this was the thing pressing against him in the quiet of the lodge, was do them from a starting point of having lost something that mattered in the human way rather than the political way. He had been exiled from a throne before this week. He had not been, he searched for the right word and found that he only had an approximate one. He had not been relocated from somewhere he had begun to want to stay. He heard Saris behind him, banking the fire for the night. The small sounds of her moving through the routine of the lodge's evening. The particular competence of it. He turned around. She was crouched in front of the hearth with the iron tool, managing the coals with the economical attention she gave everything. She did not look up. "You should sleep," she said. "Hard ride tomorrow. You'll want to eat before dawn." "I know. I'll have coffee and food ready at 4. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had handed him her mother's most valuable documents without ceremony, who had stood in a doorway against a force she had no obligation to stand against, who had asked him the question nobody else had asked, "Is she right?" and taken his answer straight without requiring it to be packaged in reassurance. "Saris," he said. She looked up. "When this is done," he stopped. He was not a man who made promises forward into uncertain ground. He had broken enough by accident to have learned not to make them deliberately. She watched him stop himself. Her expression was level and direct and did not fill the silence for him. "When it's done," he said finally, "I'd like to come back here." She considered him for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the fire and moved a coal with precision and said, without particular inflection, "Lodge will be here." It was not a promise. It was not an invitation exactly. It was the statement of a woman who does not trade in assurances she cannot guarantee, who keeps her accounts in facts rather than feelings, who had said more in 3 words than most people managed in a paragraph. It was enough. He went upstairs. He did not sleep for a long time again, but this time the thoughts running through him had direction, a route, a timeline. Documentation folded in his coat pocket that had the power to shift everything if he could get it to the right hands before the council convened. He thought about the garrison soldiers in the east, exposed in outposts that had been deliberately thinned. He thought about Harwick driving south on the visible road tomorrow, playing normal for whatever watchers Varessa had stationed. He thought about Delwyn at the commission registry, who had trained under Saris's mother, and might, if the woman's loyalty ran to truth rather than power, provide authentication for the survey records at the moment they were most needed. He thought about Varessa's face as she said, "We'll see which matters more at the end." He thought about Saris crouched at the hearth saying, "Lodge will be here." He was still thinking when sleep finally took him. At 4 in the morning, the lodge's kitchen was lit and warm. He came downstairs to coffee and bread and hard meat and Saris at the counter with her own cup, wearing her work clothes, her hair pulled back. She had clearly not slept much either, but she had the quality of a person whose tiredness does not make them slower, only more internal. She pushed his cup toward him. He took it. For a few minutes they did not speak. The fire. The dark outside the windows. The specific silence of a building at 4 in the morning that belongs to the people who are already awake. "Keth will have your horse ready," she said. "I told him you were leaving early for a border survey." "What did he say?" "Nothing. He doesn't ask." He looked at her. "You've protected a lot of people in this lodge." "I've housed a lot of people. Protecting is a different thing." She drank. "You protect yourself. I just don't get in the way." He finished the coffee. The bread. He stood and took his coat from the peg, the second peg, the one that didn't drop things. He put on the coat. He stood at the door for a moment with his hand on the iron handle. Something about this specific geometry of departure, a door, a morning, a person standing at a counter who does not tell you to come back safe because she knows that the telling doesn't affect the outcome, felt significant in a way he could not yet name. He filed it away. I was good at filing things he couldn't yet name. He turned. "The map," he said. "Your mother's third pass survey." "Memorized," she said. "You don't need to take the original." He nodded. He opened the door to the pre-dawn dark. The cold hit him immediately. The particular cold of just before light, when the temperature drops to its lowest point before the day decides to begin. He could see the stable from here. Keth moving inside with a lamp, Ashen's pale flank visible through the open stable door. He had 1 foot over the threshold when Sarah said, "Draven!" He stopped. He turned back. She was looking at him from the counter with an expression that for once was not composed. Not broken either. Not afraid, but simply present in the unmanaged way that faces only manage in the very early morning when the performance budget has run out. "She left something," Sarah said. He waited. "When she was here, one of her guards." He was in the stable for less than 3 minutes while the others were at the door. "I watched him through the east window." Her voice was completely steady. "He put something in your saddlebag." The silence lasted 1 full second. Then Draven turned and crossed the ground between lodge and stable in 12 fast strides, and in the lamplight of the stable with Keth, watching from the far end with wide eyes and no idea what was happening, he opened the saddlebag and found beneath his extra shirt and the folded papers a small brass-cased device with a night veil cipher pressed into the lid, and around it, wrapped 3 times with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much was needed, enough slow-burn cord to ignite it quietly, at a distance, without being present for the result. He stood there with it in his hands. The cord was cold. It had not been lit, which meant whoever was supposed to light it was still waiting for the signal, which meant they were close. He looked at Keth. "How long has my horse been saddled?" "Hour, sir," Miss Sarah said early. "Anyone in this stable besides you since midnight?" Keth hesitated. "Long enough." "One of the riders," the boy said he forgot something in the tack room. I didn't think Draven was already moving. He came out of the stable with the device in his hands and scanned the road, the tree line, the building's east and north faces in the gray pre-light, and found in the shadows at the northeast corner of the lodge exactly what he was looking for. A figure, still, dark-coated, and holding something small that caught the pre-dawn light the way brass does. The second device. A matched pair. The lodge, he understood in that specific freezing second of total clarity, was not the secondary target. The lodge was the primary. And Sarah's veil was inside it. He did not think. Thinking was for men who had time. Draven dropped the device into the stable's water trough and ran, not toward the figure at the northeast corner, toward the lodge door. The figure would have a partner. Varessa never sent one where 2 would serve. And if there was a matched pair of devices, then the second trigger point was not the northeast corner. It was somewhere he couldn't yet see, and the lodge had 4 walls and 1 woman inside who did not know that the morning she was running on schedule had already been calculated against her. He hit the lodge door with his shoulder at full speed. It gave. He was inside in the same motion, already calling her name before the door had swung back. "Ceres." She came from the kitchen doorway immediately, not startled. She had heard his boots on the ground outside and was already moving to meet the sound. She looked at his face and read it completely in under a second. "What?" she said. Not a question, a preparation. "Device in my saddlebag, another one outside northeast corner. There's a second trigger position I haven't found." He crossed to the east window and looked out without showing his face to the glass. "Someone was in your stable last night." She was already moving, not away from danger. Into the lodge itself, to the small room behind the kitchen where she kept the maintenance tools. He heard her pulling something from a shelf. She came back with a hand axe and a coil of rope, and he understood from that combination alone that she had thought about this building's emergencies before. That neutral ground did not mean naive ground, and that Ceres Vale had prepared for the kind of trouble that came without announcement. "The northeast device," she said. "Was it on a cord?" "Yes." "How long?" 12 feet, slow burn." "Then the trigger position is within 12 feet of the northeast corner, which puts it—" She moved to the north-facing kitchen window and looked out at the angle. "There." She pointed. "That gap between the wood store and the back wall. You can't see it from the stable or the main road. I can see it from here." He came to look. She was right. A narrow shadow space between the stacked wood and the stone, wide enough for a person to stand in and not be visible from either approach. "How do we flush him?" he said. "We don't," she said. "I do." He turned to look at her. She held his gaze with the flat steadiness of someone who has already done the calculation and is presenting the answer, not opening a negotiation. "If you go around that corner, he lights it. He's waiting for movement from inside the building. That's what the other one in the stable was designed to confirm. Sound of someone leaving, then ignition." She looked back at the window. "But if I go out the kitchen door toward the wood store, It reads as normal morning routine. He's not watching for me. He's watching for you. Ceres, I've done harder things in this building at 4 in the morning, she said. Move to the front window. When I clear the wood store, you'll have a line on him from the door. This is the problem with people who are competent inside their own ground. They are right. And being right does not make it easier to watch them walk toward the thing you would rather put yourself between them. And Draven understood in that moment something that has no clean name in the tactical literature. The specific helplessness of a man who is used to being the most capable person in a dangerous room, discovering that he is not, in fact, the most capable person in this particular room, on this particular ground, in this particular situation. Ceres Vale knew this building, this yard, this dark gap between the wood store and the back wall, in the way he knew Moonspire's corridors and the eastern garrison approaches. This was her territory, and he was, in the most basic sense, a guest. He moved to the front window. She went out the kitchen door. He watched through the glass as she crossed the yard with the axe carried loosely against her thigh, moving with the deliberate rhythm of someone whose body remembers ordinary tasks, heading toward the wood store with the specific unremarkability of a woman getting wood for a morning fire. Nothing about her movement announced itself as anything other than routine. The shadow in the gap shifted. Draven was out the front door and around the north side of the building in 4 seconds. He came around the corner to find the figure half emerged from the shadow space, his attention still on Ceres, not yet registered to the threat coming from his left. Draven hit him before he completed the turn. Not clean. The man had a half-second of reaction and got his shoulder up. But enough. They went down together against the stack of wood. A cord dropped into the mud. Draven got the man's arm behind him and held it there with a pressure that made escape a choice between compliance and a broken joint. The man chose compliance. Ceres had turned. She was standing 3 feet away with the axe at her side, looking at the man on the ground with an expression that was not satisfaction and not relief. Something more complex than either. The particular look of a person who prepared for a worse case that has now arrived and is processing the confirmation. "Who sent you?" Draven said. The man said nothing. Draven increased the pressure. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and then I'm going to stop asking and start making decisions for you. Who sent you?" "You know who," the man said. His voice was rough and steady. A professional, trained to hold under this kind of pressure for some period of time. Not indefinitely. Just long enough to feel like he'd done his duty to whoever was paying him. "I know who gave the order," Draven said. "I want to know who gave the instruction, specifically, the room and the face." A pause. "Pembar," the man said. Draven went still. Pembar, not Veressa directly. Pembar's hand, Pembar's arrangement, Pembar who had reallocated the garrison soldiers and left them exposed, Pembar who had been Veressa's political ally for a decade, and who apparently had decided to extend that alignment into territory that no council vote covered. "Was she in the room?" Draven said. Another pause. Shorter. "No," the man said. That was the detail that mattered. Veressa had not been present when this was arranged, which meant one of two things. Either she had given Pembar enough latitude to operate without her direct instruction, which was terrifying in its implication of how deeply she had built her network inside the council, or Pembar had moved independently, which was terrifying in a different way because it meant her inner circle was operating on assumed mandate rather than explicit command, a system with no breaks. Draven released the arm, stood up, looked at Ceres. She met his eyes and said nothing. He looked back down at the man. "Get off this ground," he said. "Don't come back. If I see Nightveil riders within sight of this building before I am finished with what I'm doing, I will send Pembar a message he will not enjoy receiving." The man got up. He looked at neither of them. He walked north and did not look back. They stood in the mud beside the wood stack for a moment. The pre-dawn dark. The device's cord still lying in the ground. Ceres bent down and picked it up, coiled it with the efficiency of someone who finds uses for things, and tucked it into her apron pocket. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Ceres?" She looked up. And for just one moment, underneath the composed practicality, he could see it, the cost of the last 5 minutes written in the slight tightness around her eyes, and the way she breathed once, carefully, through her nose. Then it was managed back into its place with the kind of internal discipline that doesn't announce itself because it has been practiced so many times, it has become simply the way the body handles load. "I'm all right," she said. "Go. You need to move before full light." He looked at her for 3 more seconds than he needed to. Then he went to get Ashen. The road through the third pass in full dark was exactly as difficult as the survey maps had suggested, and more difficult than he had fully internalized from looking at lines on parchment. The terrain was not hostile in the way that mountains are hostile. It was not steep enough to kill you, not exposed enough to freeze you, but it was the particular relentlessness of ground that has not been maintained, that has been reclaimed by the 30 years of growth and collapse that happens to any corridor no one uses. Roots across the path. A section of the old track that had washed out and been replaced by loose stone. 2 stream crossings that had no bridge anymore, just the stones beneath the water and the sound of the horse's careful placement. Ashen moved through it without complaint. The pale stallion had a quality that Draven had relied on in worse places. He did not borrow trouble. He addressed each obstacle as it arrived and moved on without carrying the previous one into the next. Draven, on his back in the dark, found himself doing something he rarely did in motion, thinking about a person instead of a problem. Not Varessa. Not Pembar. Not the Eastern Border Lords, and what their reception of him would look like when he arrived from an unmapped direction before dawn with documentation of manufactured garrison crisis, and a request to stand between him and a council vote. Ceres, standing in the kitchen doorway at 4 a.m. with a hand axe and a rope because she had thought about the emergencies of her building before they arrived. Walking across the yard in the dark toward a man in a shadow gap because she had correctly assessed that she was the right instrument for that particular moment and had not flinched from the assessment, handing him her mother's maps without ceremony. Sliding 3 coins back across the counter on the first morning because his dignity was a self-evident thing she saw no reason to bruise. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted things from him. The throne's gravity meant that nearly everyone in his orbit was oriented toward it. Even the loyal ones, even Harwick, even Sale, were loyal to what he represented as much as to who he was. That was the unavoidable physics of a crown. It bent everything near it. Ceres Vale was not bent. She operated on her own axis, defined by her own calculations, and what she offered, the maps, the information, the direct and undecorated regard, she offered because she had decided it was the right thing to do with her resources, not because the crown asked it of her. She didn't even particularly respect the crown. She respected the man who was trying to figure out what to do without it. That was a rarer thing than it sounded. He rode through the dark and carried it with him. The Eastern Territory showed itself at first light as a gradual change in the quality of the horizon. The specific gray-green of border country, lower elevations, the smoke of the garrison settlements visible as thin lines rising in the still morning air. He came out of the ridge pass onto the old commission track at a point roughly 4 miles northeast of the main garrison hub, as the survey had indicated, and turned south. He was seen within 20 minutes, not confrontationally. A border patrol, 2 riders, who pulled up when they saw him on the old track and looked at him with the particular calibrating attention of men who have been trained to assess threats rapidly. Then one of them looked at the horse, then at the man on the horse, and his expression changed. "That's Ashen," the man said to his companion. Draven pushed back his hood. The 2 patrol riders looked at each other. Then the one who had recognized the horse said, "Sir," with the specific inflection of someone acknowledging a form of authority that they weren't sure they were still supposed to acknowledge. And Draven understood from the conflict in the man's voice exactly how complicated the next several hours were going to be. "Take me to Commander Orell," he said. They rode. Commander Orell was a woman in her late 40s who had commanded the Eastern Garrison Hub for 6 years, and who had earned her position through the particular unglamorous competence of keeping a volatile border functional without the resources it needed, through the kind of daily problem-solving that never appears in campaign histories and never makes it into the murals in capital cities. She had a face that showed everything she'd dealt with, and none of what it had cost her. She looked at Draven across the field command table with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and said exactly what was on her mind, which was something else he had always respected about her. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. "No," he agreed. "The council sent orders last week. New command structure in progress. We're in a transitional holding period until the formal announcement." "I know." "So what exactly are you doing on my eastern ground, coming in from a direction that isn't on any map I've got?" He put Harwick's papers on the table. She uncrossed her arms. She picked them up. She read them. Unlike most people, she did not read slowly to look careful. She read the way she did everything, with focused economy, processing quickly, moving on without circling back. When she finished, she set them down and looked at him with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but the flat confirmation of a suspicion she had not wanted confirmed. Pembar's reallocation order, she said. Yes, I flagged it when it came through, 3 weeks ago. Submitted a formal concern to the Council Oversight Board. She paused. I received a response from Carver's office saying the reallocation was consistent with the new strategic framework and my concern was noted. Carver, he said. Yes. He thought about the grain tax audit, the man who had started to object when Draven named him as he walked out of that council chamber for the last time. How bad is the Eastern Line right now? He asked. Aurel picked up a map from the table and unfolded it. She pointed to 2 positions marked in red. These are the overrun posts, 12 soldiers between them, evacuated before full compromise but without their equipment. The aggression on our eastern flank from the Draven factions has been escalating for 6 weeks. They can read undermanning as well as anyone. They know when a position is soft. She looked at him. 3 more posts are at risk if we don't reinforce within 10 days. And the Council's new structure has not communicated a reinforcement plan. He stood there with his hands flat on the table and looked at the red marks on the map and felt the specific rage of a man who built something and is now watching it be quietly disassembled by people who do not understand or do not care about the human cost of each piece removed. The 12 soldiers evacuated from their posts. The 3 positions at risk. The border population behind those positions, who would not be evacuated, who would simply experience the consequences of a manufactured crisis that someone in Moonspire had decided was an acceptable cost for achieving a political objective. There is a particular philosophy that power-hungry people carry, often without naming it, that large outcomes justify granular suffering, that the mathematics of empire require some positions to be sacrificed for the strength of the whole, that this is simply how things work at the level where real decisions are made, and that people who cannot accept this calculus are sentimentalists unfit for serious governance. Draven had been called a sentimentalist by 2 different council members in the years of his reign. He had never argued the label. He had simply continued to make decisions that treated the 12 soldiers in those posts as a number that mattered, because he had learned early that a ruler who stops seeing individual costs eventually stops being able to see anything except the arithmetic of his own objectives. Varessa Nightveil was brilliant. She was strategic. She was in the process of executing the most sophisticated power consolidation he had witnessed in his lifetime. And she would produce an empire of people who had learned from her that they were variables. He looked at Aurel. I need you to receive me, he said, not as deposed king, as a man with documented evidence of manufactured crisis and a request for your support in presenting it to the Eastern Border Commission before the council vote in 7 days. Aurel looked at him for a long moment. The commission has no authority to override a council vote, she said. No, but it can demand an investigation into the grounds for the vote. That investigation, if it opens, requires a stay on implementation while it proceeds. He held her gaze. 48 hours, that's all I need the stay to buy. And in 48 hours? In 48 hours, I can reach the other 3 border commanders and the independent garrison overseers. If they submit concurrent concerns to the commission, the investigation is mandatory, not optional. That's a tight chain, Aurel said. Yes. A lot of things have to work. Yes. She looked at the papers on the table. The Pembar reallocation order. The Varessa communication that preceded it by 11 days. The careful handwriting of a man who had held 1 dissenting vote and had lived with it and finally decided that holding alone was not enough. Give me an hour, she said. I need to talk to my second. He nodded. She left the tent. He stood at the table and looked at the map, and did not let himself think about what happened if the chain broke. Not because he was avoiding the possibility. He was too honest with himself for that. But because thinking about failure at this stage was a form of spending energy on something that wasn't yet real when the real problems needed the same energy. He was good at triage. It was possibly the most useful thing a ruler actually learned under all the ceremony, what to spend yourself on now and what to bank for later. He thought instead about Harwick on the southern road, playing normal, watching his mirrors. He thought about Ceres at Ravenmere, banking a fire that had nearly been destroyed by someone who thought the lodge was simply a setting for someone else's story. He thought about whoever else Varessa had in motion right now, because a woman who ran this many pieces simultaneously always had pieces he hadn't seen yet, and the one who had been in the stable and the one in the shadow gap were only the pieces he'd found. There were others. There were always others. Aurel came back in 40 minutes, not an hour. Her second was a lean man named Graves who had the look of someone who had made up his mind before walking through the door. The commission meeting is the day after tomorrow, Aurel said. I can present the documentation. She paused. But you should know. There's a Night Vale liaison officer currently embedded with this garrison. Arrived 4 days ago under the new transitional structure protocol. Draven went still. She'll report my decision to receive you within an hour of it being confirmed, Aurel said. Which means Varessa knows your location within 90 minutes of right now. Is the liaison officer Night Vale military or civil? Civil, commission level. Then she can report my location. She can't report my plans without knowing them. He thought for 3 seconds. Where is she now? Morning briefing with my garrison quartermaster. Standard protocol. Aurel watched him. What are you thinking? He was thinking about a woman behind a counter who had told him she's moving ahead of schedule, which means whatever she was waiting for, she's gotten it. I was thinking about the matched pair of devices. 2 targets. The Lodge as primary. Why the Lodge, and not him directly? Because eliminating him outright, even by arranged accident, was a risk she would not take. The political fallout of a deposed king dying violently was unpredictable and potentially reversible. But destroying the Lodge, and the documentation inside it, and the woman who knew the ground better than any border map, that was a different calculation. That was eliminating the infrastructure, cutting the supply line rather than the general, which meant Varessa knew. She knew about the maps. She knew about Ceres. She knew that the Lodge was not just a waypoint but an operational anchor, which meant she had a source closer than Pembar. He turned the thought over. Harwick. He had known Harwick for 15 years. He had trusted Harwick's one dissenting vote and his willingness to carry documentation south at personal risk. He did not want to take the next thought, but he had learned long ago that not wanting to think something was not the same as not needing to think it. Harwick had known where Draven was. Harwick had known about the maps. Harwick had been the one to bring the documentation to the Lodge in the first place. Documentation that authenticated Draven's counterargument, yes, but documentation whose delivery also confirmed his location, his alliance with Ceres, and the existence of the unmapped route. He thought about the third message. Unsigned. Ceres Vale knows the southern corridor better than any border map. Let her show you. He had burned that message. He had not known who sent it. He had been careful because unnamed advice felt like a snare. But someone had known to send it. Someone had known that Ceres Vale had those maps before he arrived at Ravenmere. Someone had arranged for him to walk through that specific door. He sat down in the camp chair and pressed the heel of his hand against his jaw and looked at the map without seeing it for a moment, while the architecture of what had actually happened rearranged itself into a shape he recognized but did not want to. Aurel was watching him. Draven, she said. Give me a minute. She gave it. He thought about trust. Not in the abstract philosophical way that people who have not tested it tend to think about it, as a value, a virtue, a thing to aspire toward. He thought about it as a structural material, the way he thought about every material used in building, what it held, how much weight it was designed to bear, what it looked like when it failed. He had built the architecture of his council on 20 years of accumulated trust, and he had watched it fail, and he had thought he understood the failure points. Carver's resentment, Pembar's alignment, Doran's self-interest, the 3 newer members who voted safety. He had not fully looked at Harwick. One dissenting vote, the emotional anchor of a man who appeared to be the last loyal piece, the person who came south with documentation that felt like salvation, the person who knew where Draven was and what he had and where he was going next. And Harwick was currently on the southern road, playing normal, visible to anyone who wanted to track him, or he was somewhere else entirely. He stood up. Aurel, your liaison officer, does she have communication access to Moonspire? Standard courier system. Not fast enough. He turned to Graves. Does this garrison have a signal relay, the ridge towers? 2 active, Graves said. 3rd was decommissioned 6 months ago. The 3rd tower. The decommissioned one. Would it still physically function if someone operated it manually? Graves considered for a moment. Mechanically, probably yes. The mirror apparatus doesn't require maintenance to function, it just requires someone to operate it. But if the receiving station on the other end isn't, the receiving station at Moonspire's northern wall, Draven said, is it still manned? It was as of 3 weeks ago, Aurel said slowly. We used it for a routine confirmation. I don't know its current status. If Harwick is not what he appears to be, Draven said, then Varessa knows my route, my timeline, but the commission plan before I've executed a single step of it. He looked at Aurel directly. Which means the commission meeting in 2 days is not a solution. It's a trap. The words sat in the tent with them. Aurel, who was not a woman who panicked, set her jaw and looked at the map and went through it with the methodical focus of someone who has been handed a problem and is looking for its actual edges. If it's a trap, she said carefully, then what she wants is for you to show up at the commission meeting with the documentation publicly, so she can have it dismissed under the new authority framework and demonstrate that your counter-agency has failed through legitimate process. She looked at him. She doesn't want you arrested or disappeared. She wants you publicly defeated, legitimately, in front of the people whose authority actually matters. Yes, so the commission meeting is not where you want to be. No. Then where do you want to be? He had been building toward the answer for the last 3 minutes, and it had arrived with the particular cold clarity of a conclusion you don't enjoy reaching. He thought about Varessa in the lodge doorway, the way she had looked past Saris Vale like she was furniture, the way she had turned at the last moment and said those words, "These border sanctuaries always are," aimed not at the room, but at the woman behind the counter, precise and deliberate, placing a pin in a map she had already drawn. She had not come to negotiate. She had come to assess. She had looked at Saris Vale, and she had looked at the lodge, and she had looked at the quality of what existed between Draven and the woman behind that counter, and she had calculated what it was worth as a pressure point. The lodge had been the primary target, not because the maps were there, not even primarily because of the documentation, because of Saris, because a deposed king with nothing to return to is a man you manage through logistics. A deposed king with something he values in a specific location is a man you can move by threatening the location. She hadn't tried to kill Saris this morning. She had tried to establish that she could. The morning's attack was not an assassination attempt. It was a demonstration, a message delivered in brass and slow-burn chord. I know where she is. I know what she is to you. I can reach her whenever I decide it's useful to do so. And now Draven was here, on the eastern border, 90 minutes away from his location, being reported to Moonspire, 2 days away from a commission meeting that was a design trap, and with a source of intelligence inside his own chain that he could not yet confirm or eliminate. He had 7 days before the council vote. He had one unmapped route back. He had a woman standing in a lodge that had just been demonstrated to be within reach of Varessa's network. And he had a choice that was not really a choice. He could continue the commission plan and walk into a designed failure in front of the only audience that mattered. Or he could abandon the plan entirely and do something that could not be predicted, could not be prepared for, and could not be countered in advance, because it had not yet been decided. But to do that required abandoning the version of himself that had been trying to win this through process, through documentation, through the legitimate channels of a system that the other side was already operating inside. You cannot outmaneuver someone within a system they have already captured. That was a law as fundamental as any physical one. The people who tried it became examples of its enforcement. To win this, he had to stop trying to work within what existed and start building something that didn't yet have a framework she could counter. He had to stop being the deposed king seeking reinstatement and become something else, something she hadn't mapped, hadn't calculated, hadn't accounted for in her architecture. He had to stop asking the system for permission. He looked at Aurel. I need your fastest rider and a closed dispatch to 3 garrison commanders, he said. Not through commission channels. Personal, hand-carried. Not from me. From you, from your authority as hub commander, citing operational security concerns. You have that standing. I do, she said carefully, and I need your liaison officer not to leave this compound until tomorrow morning. Aurel was quiet for a moment. She looked at Graves. Something passed between them that had the character of a decision already made before the words caught up to it. She'll need a reason, Aurel said. Tell her there's been a security incident on the eastern approach, and all movements are suspended pending assessment. He picked up his coat. That's true. There was a device found in a stable at Ravenmere this morning. Aurel looked at him steadily. And where will you be? Riding back, he said. She absorbed that. To the lodge. To the lodge. She did not ask why. She was a garrison commander. She understood that when the supply line is threatened, you don't advance. You consolidate. He was already at the tent entrance when she said his name. He stopped. Whatever you're going to do when you get there, she said, do it fast. Whatever ground you think you're buying with this, Varessa will counter inside 48 hours of knowing you turned around. I know, he said. You're walking into her trap by going back. I'm walking into a trap of my own design, he said. That's a different thing. He went out into the full morning light. Ashen was at the hitching post, alert, ready. The gray stallion looked at him with dark eyes and made no complaint about the prospect of turning back through ground they had just covered, because the horse had never required reasons for what was asked of him. He simply went. Draven swung up. He sat for a moment in the light. A man who fights to reclaim what he had is fighting the last war. A man who fights to protect what he has is fighting the current one. He had spent the last 12 days fighting the last war, trying to navigate back to a throne, to a structure, to a version of his life that someone else was actively dismantling. Saris Vale was not a throne. She was not a structure. She was a woman in a lodge on neutral ground who had offered him what people in his position almost never received, the simplest possible version of what she thought. He was not going to let that become a pressure point in someone else's plan. He turned Ashen north and rode back into the ridge. The pass received him in midday silence, and somewhere ahead of him, 4 miles through unmapped ground, Ravenmere Lodge stood in the winter light, with a sign above the door and a woman inside who was going about her work with the disciplined certainty of someone who has decided that the life she built is worth the cost of building it. She did not know that the decision she had made this morning, to walk across a yard in the dark toward a man in a shadow gap, to hand a king her most valuable documents, to say Lodge will be here with the weight of a promise she hadn't called a promise, had placed her inside a calculation she had not agreed to enter. And when he came through that door, he was going to have to tell her, all of it. And whatever she did with the truth, whatever she decided in the direct and undecorated way she decided, everything, would determine the shape of everything that came after. He had managed kingdoms. He had never been as uncertain about how a conversation would go. He came out of the pass at a pace that was not safe and did not care about being safe. Ashen read the urgency in his rider's legs and gave him everything without being asked, that particular quality of a horse that has been in enough actual danger to understand the difference between training speed and survival speed. The pale stallion's hooves came down hard on the old commission track, throwing mud, eating ground, his breathing the measured percussion of a body working at its ceiling and holding there. Draven rode with his jaw set and his eyes reading the tree line. The math was not complicated. 90 minutes for his location to be reported. Time for a relay to Moonspire. Time for Varessa or Pembar, or whoever was actually running this piece to assess the report and decide what came next. He had maybe 3 hours before the lodge was approached again. Not with a device this time, not with a demonstration, but with something conclusive. He had felt the shape of it in the tent. She had shown him she could reach the lodge. She would not show him twice. He had 2 hours, maybe less, and 4 miles of ground between him and a building that was currently occupied by a woman who did not know she was already inside someone else's timeline. He pushed Ashen harder. The lodge appeared through the tree line at midday, amber-stoned and still, the chimney smoke rising straight in windless air. He came off the ridge track at speed and pulled up in the yard, was off the horse before Ashen had fully stopped, and went through the lodge door with the same deliberate urgency he'd carried through the pass. Saris was at the long table with a ledger. She looked up. She read him in under a second, set the pen down. "How bad?" she said. "The commission plan is compromised." He crossed to the table. "I believe Harwick is working for Varessa. He brought the documentation as genuine. I still think it's genuine. But his purpose was also to confirm my location, my plans, and the existence of the maps." She did not react with shock. She absorbed it the way she absorbed every difficult piece of information, directly, without drama, fitting it into the structure of what she already knew. "The unsigned message," she said. "Yes. Someone told you to come here specifically." "Yes." She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "And she knows about the maps." "She has to. The attack this morning wasn't about killing me or destroying the lodge. It was a demonstration. She was showing me that she has reach here." He looked at her steadily. "She's going to use you as leverage. If she can establish that threatening this place moves me, she controls my next step." Sarah stood up from the table. She did not look frightened. She looked like a person who has just received the correct information to make a decision she has been building toward and is now building it faster. "Then we don't give her the step," she said. "Ceres, how long before they come back?" 2 hours, probably less. She was already moving, not panicking, calculating. She went to the kitchen and he heard her opening the cabinet where she kept the maintenance supplies. He followed her to the doorway. You need to leave, he said. Take your mother's originals and go to the Eastern Commission Registry, to Delwyn. Stay there. She turned from the cabinet with the rope from her apron pocket and a second length she'd retrieved from inside. She set them both on the kitchen table. The lodge is my name on that sign, she said. I am not leaving my building for a woman who thinks it's a stage. This isn't about the building. No, she agreed. It's about not letting someone else's calculation determine what I do with my own ground. She looked at him with that direct, undecorated regard. You came back. That tells me you have a plan that doesn't work without this location. He had not told himself that explicitly. But she was right. The way she was usually right about the things he hadn't yet finished saying. The commission meeting is a trap, he said, but the documentation is real. If I can get it to the right people before the vote, not through the commission channel, not through Harwick's route, there are 2 members of the oversight board who are not inside Varessa's network. Independent appointments from the border territories. How do you reach them without using the channels she's watching? I don't. You do. He came into the kitchen. Your mother's commission registry connection, Delwyn. If she sends the documentation through the Survey Commission's internal channel rather than the political one, it arrives outside Varessa's monitoring framework. Survey records are not political documents. They don't go through the same relay. Saris looked at him for a moment. You want me to carry it? I want you to be somewhere safe while I... Draven! She held up a hand, not aggressive, just stopping the sentence before it became something she would have to push back against harder. Tell me the actual plan, not the version where you've arranged for me to be somewhere else. He looked at her for a long moment. Here is what he understood in that moment, and had been circling for days without landing on cleanly. Saris Vale was not a person you protected by removing her from the situation. She was a person who operated most effectively when given accurate information and the latitude to make her own decisions about it. Trying to manage her towards safety was not protection. It was the same architecture that Varessa used, deciding what someone else should know, what they should do, where they should stand. He had watched Varessa do it and found it intolerable. He did not get to do a softer version of it and call it care. The actual plan, he said, is that you take the documentation to Delwyn through the survey channel while I stay here and give Varessa's people something to report back to her that keeps their attention on this location for the next 6 hours. If she's watching the lodge, I need her to keep watching the lodge, not watching the Survey Commission office. You're using yourself as the distraction. I'm using the lodge as the distraction. I happen to be in it. A pause. What happens when they don't just watch, she said. Then I deal with that. Alone. I've dealt with worse alone. She looked at him with the expression of a person who is running multiple calculations simultaneously and is not going to pretend otherwise. Then she picked up the rope from the table and handed it to him. The second length is for the east gate. Bar it. The north window shutter's latch has been loose for 2 weeks. I haven't fixed it because I haven't had time. If someone's going to come in from the north, that's where. She picked up the other length for herself. And if I'm not back by nightfall, don't wait for me. I'll wait for you. That wasn't a request, she said. It was information. I'm giving you 6 hours. I know the eastern route faster than any rider Varessa has stationed on this road because I've walked it in every season since I was 9 years old. She held his gaze. 6 hours. Then you move without me. He looked at her. He did not say what was in him to say because they did not have time for it. And because she would not want it said under these conditions. Would not want something real exchanged in the compressed air of an emergency because it couldn't be trusted as clean, because emergencies make people say things proximity and adrenaline are responsible for rather than honest feeling. So he said the only thing that was both true and useful. Be fast, he said. She took the documents from the counter, her mother's originals, wrapped in oilskin, tucked against her body under her coat, and went out the kitchen door. He listened to her footsteps cross the yard. Then silence. He turned and went to work. The north window latch took 3 minutes to repair properly. He found the loose pin, reset it with a second smaller pin from the toolbox, tested it. Solid. He barred the east gate with the rope. Not a permanent deterrent, but enough to slow someone down and create sound. He moved the long table from the center of the common room to the east wall. Not defensive positioning exactly, more like removing the obstacle from the center of a space he might need to move through quickly. He checked both fireplaces for the structural sound of them. He found the trapdoor to the cellar that Saris had mentioned on the first morning, the hidden passages she'd referenced only obliquely, describing them as her mother's engineering, and confirmed it was accessible and clear. Then he sat at the counter with a cup of cold coffee from the morning pot and waited. Waiting is its own discipline. Most people do not understand this about men built for action. The popular image is of restless energy, of a man like Draven unable to sit still under pressure. The truth is that the most dangerous people in any situation are the ones who have learned to wait with absolute physical economy, who can sit in complete stillness while every cognitive process runs at full capacity, who do not waste themselves on anxiety, because anxiety is not information and they need all their resources available for the moment when action is actually required. And sat, he thought. He thought about Varessa's plan at its actual scale, not what she had presented to the Council, the Eastern Alliance, the renewed mating agreement, the political architecture of a unified approach to the border crisis. That was the structure she was building. What he was thinking about now was the foundation underneath it, a manufactured crisis, a reallocation order signed by Pembar, garrison soldiers exposed on purpose. And underneath even that, the question he had not yet answered, what she needed the crisis to produce that the political negotiation alone couldn't generate. An emergency condition. That was the answer, and it was both simple and devastating. She needed the Eastern situation to deteriorate past the point where the Council could debate solutions and into the territory where solutions had to be implemented immediately, without the standard deliberation period. Crisis governance was a specific legal condition under the Moonspire Charter. If the eastern border reached the threshold of active emergency, the Council could invoke crisis provisions that bypassed normal succession requirements. Under crisis governance, an appointed authority, not an elected one, not a bloodline one, could assume executive command for a defined period. Defined by whom? Under crisis governance? By the Council, which she already controlled. He set down the cup. She wasn't taking the throne. She was making the throne irrelevant by creating the conditions under which whoever the Council appointed had more functional authority than any traditional succession. The mating alliance was the distraction. The real architecture was underneath it, and it was almost perfect. Almost. Because she needed the Eastern crisis to hit the emergency threshold inside the 7-day window before the vote. And the Eastern crisis, despite the manufactured reallocation, despite the exposed garrisons, had not yet crossed that threshold. It was close, but not there, which meant something else was coming, something that would push it over. He was still sitting with that thought when he heard the horses, not 2 this time, not a patrol. The sound of an organized approach, 6, maybe 8 riders, coming from the North Road with the specific purposeful rhythm of people who are not conducting surveillance anymore. They have received a new instruction and are implementing it. He stood. He moved to the east-facing window and confirmed the east approach was clear, then to the north window, the one with the latch he'd just fixed, and looked out at the road. 8 riders. Night veil colors, but not the ceremonial silver of Varessa's personal guard. Working colors. Men in functional gear, carrying themselves with the compact efficiency of people who have been given a specific job and are not here to negotiate about it. In front of them, on a horse she rode with the ease of someone who has never in her adult life been anywhere she didn't intend to be, was Varessa Nightveil. Not a liaison, not an advance party. Her. Which meant she had not sent a report to Moonspire from the Eastern Garrison. She had never gone to Moonspire. She had come south herself when the morning's devices failed to produce the desired result, and she had arrived in person because this was the piece she had decided to close herself. Draven understood in that moment what she was willing to do. Not manage this from a distance. Not use intermediaries. Come here, to neutral ground that her presence would by definition violate, and do whatever she had come to do with her own face on it. The thing people do not understand about ruthless intelligence is that it does not always look ruthless. Varessa was not a screaming conqueror. She was a precise person who had made peace with what her objectives required. She would walk through that door and offer him one more conversation, and the conversation would be the same as the last one, except that this time the alternative she left on the table when he refused would not be a demonstration. He had 4 minutes before she reached the door. He used them. He went to the cellar trap, confirmed the passage. Stone steps, low ceiling, a corridor that ran east under the yard and surfaced at a point behind the stable. He left it open. He went back to the counter. I was there when the knock came. 3 strikes. The same as before. That was her, not her guards. She had a specific knock. Architectural. The kind that announced without requesting. He opened the door. She was alone on the step. Her 8 riders had spread to the yard perimeter, not blocking exactly, but present in every direction. She looked at him with an expression that had dropped several layers of construction since the morning. What was left was something he had not seen from her in years. The direct face of a woman who has decided that performance is no longer necessary because there is no audience she needs to perform for. You turned back from the Eastern garrison, she said. Not accusing, observing. Yes. That tells me you know about Harwick. It tells you I suspected, he said. Confirmation is different. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, May I come in? He stepped back. She entered alone. He noted the 8 riders in the yard. He noted the east gate with the rope he'd run across it. She would have noted it too, or her riders would have. He noted that he had left the trapdoor open and that she could not see the trapdoor from where she was standing. She stopped in the center of the common room, where the long table usually sat and now did not. She noticed the table's absence. You moved it, she said. I rearranged, he said. A pause. She's not here, Veressa said. I don't know who you mean. Saris Vale. She said the name with the precision of someone who has spent time on it. She left within the last 2 hours. East direction, on foot. She held his gaze. My riders tracked her to the tree line. He did not react. I didn't send anyone after her, Veressa said. I want you to know that. Why would I believe that? Because she's not what I'm here for. She moved to the hearth and stood before it, and in the firelight she was devastatingly herself. Silver-haired, composed, carrying the full weight of what she intended without showing it in her posture. Draven. We have been moving pieces against each other for 3 weeks, and it has cost both of us things that didn't need to be spent. I want to end it. By ending it, you mean, I want to offer you the actual terms, not the document I brought this morning, not the performance of a negotiation. She turned from the fire. The Eastern crisis reaches emergency threshold in approximately 36 hours. I have the documentation prepared for council submission. Once it's filed, crisis governance provisions activate and the vote becomes procedural. He looked at her. And you came here to tell me that. I came here to tell you that it doesn't have to be filed. She let that sit for 1 full second. If you withdraw from the counter-move you've initiated, the garrison commanders, the commission contact, whatever you've set in motion, I will not file the emergency documentation. The crisis threshold will be managed through normal procedure. The Eastern situation stabilizes. The council vote proceeds on standard timeline. And Veressa Nightveil becomes the senior political partner of the Moonspire Nightveil Alliance, not regent, not appointed authority. A formal alliance with negotiated shared governance. Her eyes were level and direct. I am offering you a version of this that does not require your destruction. He stood very still. Here is what he understood and what he needed to hold clearly in the middle of everything else pressing on him. Veressa was not lying. That was the thing about her that made her more dangerous than people who lied. She believed in the efficiency of truth delivered strategically. What she was telling him was accurate. The emergency documentation existed. The Eastern threshold was 36 hours away. She had the mechanism, and she was offering to not use it in exchange for his withdrawal, which meant his counter-move was working, which meant something he had set in motion. Orel's riders to the border commanders, the survey commission channel, whatever Saris was doing on the Eastern Road right now, was close enough to the target that she had come here herself rather than waiting for the vote to resolve it. She was afraid of something. Which part worries you? He said. She held his gaze. I'm not worried. Veressa, you're standing in a lodge on neutral ground that you've violated twice today. You drove here yourself instead of sending a relay. You are offering me a version of peace you didn't offer this morning. He watched her face. Something changed between the garrison report and now. A silence of 4 seconds. Delwyn filed a survey commission inquiry, she said. He did not allow himself to feel relief because relief was a physical sensation that she would read. Survey records, he said. That's not a political document. No, but a survey commission inquiry into the mapping of third-pass corridor routes, routes that are not on current imperial charts, automatically triggers a boundary review process. A boundary review, under commission protocol, requires notification to every garrison commander, border lord, and independent oversight officer in the territory covered. Her voice had not changed in pitch or pace. Only someone who knew her voice as well as he did would hear the thing underneath it, the sound of a plan meeting friction it had not fully modeled. It creates a notification chain I cannot intercept without directly interfering with commission process, which carries its own legal exposure. So the documentation reaches the people it needs to reach, he said, without going through any channel you control. Inside 48 hours, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Saris had done it. On an eastern road she'd walked since she was 9 years old, carrying her mother's oilskin-wrapped originals. She had reached Delwyn at the commission registry and filed a survey inquiry that had just detonated inside Varessa's architecture, like a very small and very perfectly placed charge. He looked at the woman across the room from him, and for the first time in this conversation, he let what he was feeling into his face. Not anger, not triumph, something more considered than either. The emergency documentation, he said. File it. She went still. File it, he said again. Take it to the council tomorrow. Invoke crisis governance, because the notification chain Delwyn's inquiry just triggered will reach every independent oversight officer in the Eastern Territory before the council convenes, and those officers will have survey documentation establishing that the corridor reallocation that produced the crisis was preceded by a Night Vale communication 11 days prior. He held her gaze. You can invoke crisis governance. And the first question the independent overseers ask will be who manufactured the crisis. The silence in the room was the specific silence of two people who have been moving against each other across a very large board and have both just arrived at the same square at the same time. Varessa looked at him. For the first time in this conversation, in perhaps a long time, he saw what was beneath the architecture. Not vulnerability, exactly. Something more precise. The face of a person who has constructed a perfect plan and is now standing at the exact point where its perfection ends. You would burn everything to prove the point, she said. I would hold everything to the light, he said. What burns is what doesn't survive light. I'm not choosing what that is. You already did. She turned away from him. She looked at the fire. She was very still in the way that people who have practiced composure are still, not peaceful, but controlled. The difference was audible to anyone who knew what controlled stillness actually sounded like. Pembar acted without my direct instruction, she said very quietly. Then say that, in writing, in front of the council. She turned back. And what does that cost me? The manufactured crisis, the emergency provisions, the crisis governance mechanism. He crossed the room toward her, not aggressive, just closing the distance between two people who need to see each other clearly. The alliance negotiation can proceed, real negotiation, without a gun at the Empire's east wall. She looked at him from 3 feet away, close enough to read the grain of every intention in his face. You would accept the alliance, she said. I would accept a negotiated agreement that serves the Eastern Territory and does not hand succession to anyone without a charter-compliant process. That is not what I came here to negotiate. I know. He held her gaze. It's what you're going to negotiate, because your alternative is a boundary review that surfaces everything, and you will not survive that surface. The fire crackled. 8 riders in the yard. 1 woman on an eastern road who had done something so quietly devastating that it had brought a political architect to a lodge in the neutral corridor to offer terms she hadn't planned to offer. Varessa studied him, and he saw something in her face that he had not expected to see. Not calculation, but recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has met the edges of what they can control and is deciding, in real time, what kind of person they want to be at those edges. She opened her mouth, and then every window in the lodge lit orange. Not dawn, not lamplight, fire. He spun to the north window. The stable was burning. Not slowly, not from inside, but from all 4 sides simultaneously, the specific simultaneity of an accelerant-fed ignition that someone had laid and waited to trigger. In the yard, 2 of Varessa's 8 riders were down on the ground. The others had drawn weapons and were scanning in every direction with the controlled urgency of people who have just lost the perimeter they thought they held. From the tree line north of the road, a column of riders emerged. Not night veil colors, not imperial colors. Black coats, no insignia. Moving fast, organized, with a specific formation of a unit that is trained together and is executing a pre-planned approach rather than a reactive one. Draven turned to Veressa. Her face had gone white. "Those aren't my people," she said. "I know," he said, because he recognized the formation. He had designed it. 12 years ago, when he was still a general rather than a king, he had designed a rapid approach formation for engagement in constrained terrain. Low profile, high speed, triangle advance to cut off both road exit points simultaneously. He had taught it to one commander personally, a man who had then gone east and spent the next decade training border units in the specific tactical approach his former general had given him, Commander Orell. He had told her to send riders. He had not told her to send them to the lodge. "She moved up the timeline," he said, mostly to himself. "What?" Veressa said. "My garrison commander moved up the timeline." He was already at the counter, grabbing his coat. "She didn't wait for the commission meeting. She saw the liaison officer's report. She knew I was coming back here, and she sent a unit to cover the location." "There are 12 of Orell's riders against my 8, Veressa said, and her voice had sharpened into something that was not panic but was adjacent to it. The accelerated processing of a woman whose very precise plan has just encountered a variable she did not model. "This becomes a military incident on neutral ground." "Yes," he said. "That is not—" She stopped. "Draven, if this becomes a military incident, the Eastern situation triggers automatic emergency protocol. Independently. I don't have to file anything." He stopped moving. She was right. If Orell's unit engaged Veressa's riders on neutral corridor ground, if a military exchange happened here, right now, before any council vote, before any commission inquiry resolved, the Eastern Emergency Protocol activated automatically under Charter. No filing required. The crisis governance provisions would snap into place by pure legal mechanism. And the question of who controlled the provisions would be determined by whoever was positioned to answer it fastest. Veressa's network was already inside the council. He had 12 riders outside and a woman somewhere on an eastern road, and 48 hours of notification chain that would reach the right people. But not instantly, not in the next 30 minutes, while a fight happened in a lodge yard on neutral ground. He looked at Veressa. She looked at him. Two people who had been moving against each other across a very large board had just arrived at a square that neither of them had designed, and both of them had contributed to building. The stable burned. Outside, the first exchange of voices. Orell's riders calling a halt. Veressa's people responding with their own authority. The taut back and forth of two armed groups deciding whether this moment becomes the thing neither can take back. "Call your riders off," he said. "Call yours," she said. "I don't have a signal." "Neither do I." She held his gaze. "If they engage, it doesn't matter who wins the fight. We both lose everything to the protocol." He crossed to the door. He put his hand on the iron handle. Here's what a man understands when he is standing at this specific juncture. When the mechanism of disaster is audible through a door, and the next 30 seconds will determine whether it locks into motion or doesn't, there is no move that is safe. There is only the move that is least catastrophic, chosen fast, from imperfect information, by a person who has to live with the choice regardless of how it falls. Kings are not made by their perfect decisions. They are made by their ability to make decisions when there are no perfect ones, and to stand in the consequences without telling themselves a story about why it wasn't their fault. He had made the mistake of believing, for a brief and damaging period, that love and power occupied separate rooms that could be kept from touching each other. He had been wrong. Every personal failure had found its way into the political architecture, and every political compromise had bled into the human one. They were not separate rooms. They were the same room. They had always been the same room. He opened the door. He stepped into the yard between two armed units with his hands open at his sides, and his face showing everything it actually was. Not the Silver Fang, not the deposed king, not the counter-strategist, or the man in the lodge, or the general who designed the formation currently pointed at him from the tree line. Just a man, standing between two fires, choosing to be visible rather than tactical. "Hold," he said. His voice had a quality that he did not produce intentionally. It was something that had developed over years of using it in exactly these conditions, in gaps between armies, in rooms full of people who needed a sound to attach certainty to. It moved across the yard and the riders on both sides heard it and the exchange of voices stopped. Orell's unit held. Varessa's remaining 6 held. He stood in the yard with the stable burning behind him and the pre-afternoon light coming down flat and gray, and said, louder, "This is neutral ground. I am Draven Morvane, and I am invoking the Corridor Commission Charter. All parties stand down or answer to the Commission Board in full." He had no authority to invoke that. He was not a commission officer. He was not officially anything. But he said it with the absolute certainty of a man who believes the words. And in that specific moment, that certainty was indistinguishable from authority. 2 of Varessa's riders looked at each other. Orell's unit, trained to respond to his voice, held their position. Nobody moved. He looked at the tree line. Orell's lead rider, a young man on a dark horse, holding a lance that was not yet leveled, looking at Draven with the expression of someone who has received an instruction he trusts, but is standing in a situation that instruction didn't cover. "Stand down," Draven said. "Tell Commander Orell the notification chain is already in motion. Tell her I need the next 48 hours, not the next 30 minutes. The young rider looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he raised a fist. The unit behind him settled. Draven turned to Varessa's 6 remaining riders. They were looking past him at their principal, who had followed him to the doorway and was standing on the threshold of the lodge with an expression he could not read from this angle, but could feel in the quality of the silence she was producing. "Varessa," he said. She stepped out into the yard. She looked at her riders. She looked at the burning stable. She looked at the formation in the tree line, and at Draven, standing in the middle of the yard, with his hands open like a man who has decided that the only armor left to him is his own transparency. She made a gesture. Her riders eased. The yard held. The stable burned. Nobody fired. Nobody advanced. The specific held breath of a moment that has not yet decided what it is going to be. And then from the east road, moving fast, came the sound of a single horse returning. He turned. Through the gate, past the rope he'd run across it, which had been pushed aside, which meant she'd come back through it already knowing what she'd find. Saris Vale rode into the yard on a borrowed horse from the commission registry's stable. Her coat dark with hard riding, her face set with the particular expression of a person who has done the thing they went to do and has returned to find the situation has changed considerably since they left. She pulled up. She looked at the 2 armed units. The burning stable. Varessa in the doorway. Draven in the middle of the yard. She looked at him. "Filed," she said. 1 word. He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, Varessa was looking at Saris with an expression that had finally, fully, run out of architecture. Not defeat. Not yet. But the face of a woman who has just understood that the peace she dismissed, the provincial distraction, the temporary comfort, the woman she had looked past in a doorway as if she were furniture, had been the piece that broke the plan. Not the garrison commanders. Not Harwick's documentation. Not Orell's riders, or Draven's counter-moves, or any of the large visible machinery of 2 powerful people running strategy against each other. A woman in an apron on an eastern road she had walked since she was 9 years old, carrying her mother's work in oilskin under her coat, filing a survey inquiry that was not a political document and could not be stopped by political means. The notification chain was in motion. 48 hours. It was already too late to call it back. Varessa stepped down from the threshold into the yard, and she walked toward Draven with her 8 reduced to 6, and Orell's unit at the tree line, and a burning stable crackling behind them, and she stopped 2 feet from him and said in a voice that was the quietest and most honest thing he had ever heard from her, "You're going to make me answer for Pembar's order." "Yes," he said, "in front of the full council. And the independent overseers." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Saris on the borrowed horse. Then she looked back at him with the face of a woman who has spent 20 years building and is now standing in the wreckage of the one calculation she got wrong. "Then I will need," she said very carefully, "to speak with my legal counsel before that session." He heard the concession in it. Wrapped in propriety, dressed in process, but there. He had 1 breath to take before he answered, and that was when the rider came. Not from Orell's unit. Not from the North Road. From the south. A single rider, moving with the desperate speed of someone carrying something that cannot wait, who came through the south gate at a pace that scattered Varessa's outriders, and pulled up in the center of the yard with a horse that was lathered to the chest and a face that was not carrying news. He was carrying catastrophe. He looked at Draven. He said 4 words. Moonspire is under attack. The yard went completely silent. Every rider, every hand on every weapon, the fire and the smoke and the gray afternoon light. Draven looked at the rider. From where? He said. And the answer the rider gave changed every calculation in the yard, changed the weight of every piece on the board, changed what Varessa's concession meant, and what Orel's 48 hours meant, and what the commission notification chain meant, and what the next 12 hours of either of their lives were going to look like. Because the attack on Moonspire was not coming from the east. It was coming from inside. The word inside landed in the yard and nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Draven was at the messenger's horse, one hand on the bridle, looking up at the man with the absolute focused attention of someone who needs every piece of information exactly as it is, not colored by fear or inference. Who? He said. The rider was young, hard-ridden, his face carrying the particular blankness of someone who has been moving too fast to fully process what he's carrying. Doran's faction, he said, and there are Night Vale guards inside the palace walls. Not outside. Inside. They were embedded during the diplomatic visit. Nobody counted them going in, and nobody accounted for them staying. Draven looked at Varessa. She had gone very still. Not the composed stillness she deployed deliberately. The involuntary stillness of a person receiving information that has arrived outside the boundaries of what they sanctioned. Her face, for the first time in his long knowledge of her, was doing something unmanaged. Not guilt. She was too precise for guilt to land that openly. But something in the province of it. The specific expression of a woman who built a machine and is now watching a piece of it move that she did not personally set in motion. The guards inside the palace, she said to the rider. Who commands them? The young man looked at her, uncertain of her authority, uncertain of everything in this yard. A man named Ruthless, he said. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked at Draven with the flat, undecorated honesty of a person who has run out of all alternative framings. Ruthless is Pembar's man, she said, not mine. But your guards, he said, embedded during the visit as security protocol, standard procedure. She looked at him steadily. I did not instruct them to remain. I did not instruct engagement. A pause that cost her something. Pembar gave them a separate instruction, one I was not informed of. Here is what the powerful rarely admit, and what the rest of the world spends considerable energy not believing. Even the architects of large plans do not always control every piece they have set in motion. Varessa had built a network that extended through Pembar, through Doran, through embedded guards, and manufactured garrison crises and political liaisons. She had built it with precision, and she had built it without anticipating that the people inside it would eventually begin operating on the logic she had taught them rather than waiting for her explicit instruction. Pembar had learned from her. He had learned that outcomes justified the mechanics. He had learned that a crisis, properly timed, produced leverage. And he had applied those lessons to a timeline and an objective she had not sanctioned. The machine had moved on its own. How many? Draven said to the rider. 30 guards inside. Doran's faction has 32 council loyalists. They've secured the council chamber in the eastern wing. Harwick and the independent members are, the report said, secured, not harmed. Not harmed yet. Both of them heard the unstated word. Draven looked at Orel's unit at the tree line. He looked at Varessa's 6 riders. He looked at Ceres on the borrowed horse, who was watching him with the steady regard of a person who has assessed the situation and is waiting to understand what role she is being asked to fill. He made a decision in under 4 seconds, which was longer than he usually needed and shorter than the situation deserved. But the situation was not offering additional time. Varessa. He looked at her directly. Your riders come with me under my authority, or they stay here. Your choice. Made now. She looked at him for 2 seconds. Under your authority, she said. He turned to Orel's lead rider. Tell Commander Orel the commission notification chain is active, and she needs to hold the eastern position. I need 4 of her unit. The young man nodded once and wheeled his horse. Draven turned to Ceres. She was already looking at him with an expression that said she knew what was coming and had already decided. Stay here, he said. No, she said. Ceres, I know Moonspire's service corridors. She held his gaze. My mother surveyed the palace expansion in the third year of the previous reign. I have those maps too. A pause. You didn't know that? He had not known that. He looked at her for one moment. This woman who continued to be, consistently and without announcement, in possession of exactly what was needed at the exact moment it was needed, and felt something that had no clean tactical name and was not relevant to the next 6 hours, except that it was the reason the next 6 hours mattered. Ride close, he said. She moved her horse alongside Ashen without another word. They rode north. The road to Moonspire in winter carried the specific cold of high country, not the wet cold of the corridor, but the dry, bone-reaching cold of elevation, the kind that found the gaps in a coat and settled in for the duration. Draven rode with 6 of Varessa's people, 4 of Orel's, Varessa herself on a gray mare, and Saris on the borrowed commission horse, and he thought about the palace layout, and the 30 guards inside, and the 32 council loyalists who had decided that a manufactured crisis and an insider faction gave them enough cover to move against the established structure in a single night. He thought about Harwick. Secured, the writer had said, not harmed. Harwick, who had cast the one dissenting vote and carried documentation south at personal risk, and had also, he still did not have confirmation, only inference, possibly served as a location relay for Varessa's network. The picture of Harwick was not complete. He might be victim, or he might be something more complex. Both things could be true of the same man. Most people, Draven had found, were not simple enough to be purely one thing. The quality that made Harwick willing to carry documentation in defiance of the council majority was the same quality that might have made him willing to give information to a faction he believed was the lesser danger. Loyalty, like all structural materials, bent under sufficient load before it broke. He thought about the price of what he was riding toward. Not in the political sense. He was past counting those costs. In the human sense, the palace was full of people who had no part in the council's machinations and were now inside a building that had been turned into a theater of someone else's ambitions, kitchen staff, scribes. The young guards on rotation who had taken their posts that morning expecting an ordinary day. Harwick, old and tired and possibly compromised and still possibly the most honest man in that chamber, sitting in a locked room. A ruler who stops seeing individual costs eventually stops being able to see anything except the arithmetic of his own objectives. He had said that to himself in the eastern garrison tent. He said it again now, on a winter road in the dark, to make sure it was still true. It was still true. They reached the outer wall of Moonspire at the 3rd hour of night. The palace's main approach was lit, not festively, but with the flat, overbright illumination of a building on alert, every lamp burning, the specific visual quality of a place that is trying to see everything at once because it cannot trust what it cannot see. From the ridge overlooking the approach, Draven counted the guard positions, doubled at the main gate. The eastern tower dark, which meant whoever held the eastern wing had either recalled those guards or they were secured inside. Varessa rode up beside him. The service entrance below the north wall, she said quietly. It was built during the expansion. It is not on the standard security maps. He looked at her. My mother surveyed it, Saris said from his other side. He looked between them. 2 women who had both, in entirely different ways, known things about this building that he had not. He found something almost worth a dark laugh in that, but kept it internal. Show me, he said to Saris. She took them down the ridge on a path that was not a path, a line through frozen ground that she navigated with the confidence of someone reading a map she carries in her body rather than her hands. They came out below the north wall at a point where the stonework was older, rougher, a section of original construction that the expansion had been built around rather than replacing. A low door. Iron. Hinges that had been maintained, recently, from the look of the metal, by someone who understood that a door no one knows about is still a door someone eventually needs. How do you know this was maintained? He said to her. Because I asked Delwyn, she said. She surveyed it 2 years ago for the commission's structural assessment. She said the hinges had been oiled within the year. A pause. I didn't know why at the time. I do now. He looked at the door. Someone inside the palace had been maintaining a door that wasn't on the security maps. That someone was either an ally or had been using the door for their own purposes. Either way, it opened, and it opened quietly, and that was what mattered in the next 30 seconds. He went through first. The corridor inside was low and stone and smelled of old mortar and lamp oil. No light source except what came through the door behind them. He moved on memory and instinct through the dark, counting steps, feeling the grate of the floor, reading the building through the soles of his boots, the way he had learned to read every structure he had ever operated inside. Behind him, 4 of Orell's riders, 6 of Varessa's, Varessa, Ceres. 11 people moving in darkness through a palace that didn't know they were inside it. The service corridor met the main undercroft at a junction he recognized by the change in the air. Warmer, drier, the specific atmosphere of the palace's internal circulation. From here he knew the layout. He had walked these corridors as a general, before a throne made them ceremonial. He knew where the eastern wing secured access was. He knew the council chamber's second entrance, the one used for staff that was never locked from the inside, because the assumption was that anyone who needed it had authorization. He knew where they would have put Harwick, the archive room off the council antechamber, small, interior, no windows, lockable from outside. The natural choice for anyone who needed to secure a person without visibly imprisoning them. He split the group. To Orell's 4 riders, the eastern wing access. Contain the embedded guards before they receive a signal from the council chamber. To 4 of Varessa's 6, the main corridor junction. Hold it. Let no one through in either direction until the council chamber is clear. To Varessa herself and the remaining 2 of her riders, with him. She accepted this without comment. To Ceres. Stay at the Undercroft junction with a clear line to the north door. She looked at him. If it goes wrong, he said, you go out the north door and you keep moving east until you reach the commission registry. Delwyn. You understand? She looked at him for 3 full seconds. It's not going to go wrong, she said. If it does, then I'll handle it, she said. Same as I handle everything. He held her gaze for 1 moment. Then he moved. The council chamber's second entrance was unguarded. The faction inside had not thought to cover staff access, which meant they were either overconfident or under-resourced, and either way, it was the gap he needed. He came through the door with Varessa a step behind him, and her 2 riders at the threshold, and the scene inside the council chamber resolved in the lamplight with the particular clarity of a situation that has been held in tension for too long and is now going to resolve one way or the other. Doran was at the head of the council table. Beside him, a man Draven recognized as ruthless, compact, flat-eyed, carrying the specific quality of a person who has decided that the violence he is prepared for is justified by the objective he is serving. Behind Relis, 8 guards in Night Veil livery that had been stripped of its insignia, which was both an operational decision and a statement, we are here, but we are not officially here. At the far wall, Harwick sat on the floor with his back to the stone and his wrists bound in front of him, and the expression of a very tired man who has been in a difficult room for several hours and has given up expecting rescue. Doran looked up when the door opened. He saw Draven. He looked at Varessa behind him. His face did the rapid recalculation of a man whose plan has just encountered the 2 people he least expected to arrive together. This isn't, Doran started. Sit down, Draven said. The quality of his voice in that room, the specific authority of it, the thing that had developed over 22 years of being the person other people looked to when the situation required a sound to anchor to, moved through the chamber and Doran sat down before he had consciously decided to. Relis did not sit. He moved instead, a hand toward his weapon, and stopped when he found Varessa's 2 riders between his motion and its destination, and he looked at Varessa with an expression of pure confusion. Lady Nightveil, he said. Stand down, Relis, she said. The instruction from Lord Pembar was not issued with my knowledge or authority, she said. Her voice had the specific temperature of a woman who is saying something in public that she cannot take back and has chosen not to take back. You will stand down. You will release Lord Harwick, and you will answer a full inquiry into what instructions you received and from whom. Relis looked at her for a long moment. I was a man who served power. He had learned to read which version of power was operative in any given room. And what he read in this room, Varessa and Draven arriving together, the guards already neutralized at the eastern wing by the sound of the brief exchange that had carried through the corridor, told him that the version of power he had arrived to serve was no longer the version with the most weight behind it. He moved his hand away from his weapon. Draven crossed to Harwick. He cut the binding with the knife he carried and helped the old man to his feet. Harwick stood slowly, one hand on the wall, looking at Draven with an expression that was the most complicated thing Draven had seen in a day full of complicated things. I need to tell you something, Harwick said. You relayed my location to Varessa's network, Draven said. Harwick went still. Not intentionally. The route I took south passed through a commission way station. There was a Night Vale liaison officer there. I didn't know. I only understood afterward what had been reported. He looked at Draven steadily. I didn't know about the devices at the lodge. If I had known, I know, Draven said. He did know. The picture of Harwick was not the picture of a man who had chosen a side. It was the picture of a man who had been in too many rooms with too many factions for too long and had been used as a relay without his full understanding. That was its own kind of failure. But it was not betrayal in the deliberate sense, and the difference, while not comfortable, was real. Sit, Draven said. Someone will bring you water. He turned back to the room. He looked at Doreen, who was sitting exactly where he had been told to sit, with the expression of a man who has realized that the faction he joined has dissolved around him and left him holding a position he can no longer defend. The inquiry, Draven said, will be full. Every instruction, every communication, every piece of what Pembar arranged and what you agreed to be part of. You cooperate with it, and the council handles the question of your conduct. You don't cooperate, and I make the documentation public before the commission can request its own review. He held the man's gaze. You choose now. Doran looked at the table. I'll cooperate, he said. The chamber settled, not triumphantly, not with the clean resolution of a story that has found its last page, with the specific exhausted weight of a situation that has been resolved enough to stop bleeding, which is not the same as healed. Rooms like this one do not heal quickly. They leave scar tissue in the structure, in the people who are inside them, in the institutions that have to keep functioning after the emergency has passed. Draven understood this. He had always understood this. The murals and the histories celebrated the decisive moment. What they did not show was the morning after the decisive moment, when everyone was still in the building and someone had to decide what the building was for now. He walked out of the council chamber. He went through the corridor to the Undercroft Junction. Saris was there. She had not moved from the position he had left her in, but her posture had shifted. She had heard enough through the corridor stone to know how it had gone, and what he saw when he came into the junction, lamplight, was a woman in the act of allowing herself to exhale something she had been holding for the last 40 minutes. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was mud on her coat from the eastern road, and her hair had come half out of its tie, and she was standing in the service undercroft of a palace. She had infiltrated through a door her dead mother had surveyed, and she was looking at him with the most undecorated expression he had seen on another person's face in years. He said her name. Just her name. Quietly. The way you say a word when you want it to carry its actual weight rather than any additional architecture. She said, I know. 2 words. The same weight. This is the thing that no one tells you about the moments that matter most. They are almost never the ones with the right speech and the perfectly delivered declaration. They are almost always the ones where language runs out, and what's left is simply 2 people in a corridor looking at each other and recognizing, without needing it said in any formal way, that something real is in the room and neither of them is going to look away from it. He reached out and straightened her collar. A small gesture. Completely unnecessary. The kind of thing hands do when the person they belong to has run out of tactical justification and is operating on something older and truer than tactics. She looked at his hands, then at his face. The lodge, she said. I know. The stable burned. I'll rebuild it. She held his gaze. That's not your obligation. No, he said. It's my choice. Those are different things. She was quiet for a moment. You told me you wanted to come back. When it was done. It's not entirely done, he said. No, she agreed. It won't be for a while. A pause. But you came back anyway. He had. Before it was done, before the commission inquiry, before the council restructuring, before any of the large machinery of aftermath had begun turning. He had turned ashen north from the eastern garrison because the most important thing in motion was not the political architecture. It was a person in a lodge who had become part of what he was trying to preserve, and he had not been willing to manage that from a distance. Yes, he said. She nodded once. The small nod she gave to things that were true and required acknowledgement, but not elaboration. He offered her his arm. Not romantic ceremony, just the simple human offer of steadiness after a long and damaging day. She looked at it for a moment, that carpenter's assessment, and then she took it, and they walked back through the corridor toward the north door and the winter night beyond it. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of work, the kind that does not announce itself as heroic and offers no moment of clear completion. The commission inquiry opened and ran its course with the grinding thoroughness of a process designed to be resistant to the very pressures that had caused the situation requiring it. Pembar answered for the reallocation order and the instructions to Relis. Doran answered for his cooperation with the faction. Carver answered for the grain tax, which had been going on for so long that the documentation of it was almost bored with itself. Harwick sat before the inquiry board and gave a full account, including the way station relay he had not understood he was making. The board reviewed the account. They concluded, after 3 sessions, that his disclosure was voluntary and his cooperation comprehensive, and his original documentation of the Pembar-Varessa communications was genuine and had been the instrument that ultimately enabled the commission notification chain. His conduct during the crisis was recorded as conflicted but not treasonous. He retired from the council at his own request on the morning the inquiry concluded, and no one on the board argued. Varessa Nightville appeared before the inquiry on the 4th day. She answered every question with the specific precision of a person who has been legal counsel in her own mind since early childhood, and she acknowledged what was demonstrably hers to acknowledge: the embedded guards, the political network, the manufactured pressure on the Eastern situation through channels she had encouraged without explicitly directing. She did not acknowledge Pembar's actions as her own because they were not. The board documented the distinction. She was not exiled. This was Draven's decision, and it was not a popular one with everyone who had reason to want a more decisive outcome. The case for exile was coherent. She had attempted to reshape the imperial structure through manufactured crisis and embedded intelligence assets, and an alliance proposal built on strategic deception. The argument was real. His argument was also real. Exile was the punitive instrument of a man who had not yet learned to distinguish between eliminating a threat and eliminating a person. Varessa Nightville was a threat that had been made visible. A visible threat, properly constrained by documented accountability and a public record of her methods, was less dangerous than a threat sent beyond the borders with time to rebuild without oversight. He had been exiled. He knew what exile produced in a person with sufficient resources and will. She would remain. Under a formal accountability structure, her network documented and monitored, her council access removed, her Southern Trade Route Authority restructured under independent commission oversight. Not destroyed. Constrained. The difference mattered. She accepted the terms with the composure of a person who has lost a campaign and is already determining what she can build from the remaining pieces. He did not begrudge her the composure. It was the most honest thing she had shown him in years. On the morning she departed the council chamber for the last time under the new terms, she paused at the door and looked back at him with an expression that was not quite an apology and not quite an acknowledgement, and was perhaps the most accurate thing either of them could have exchanged. "You chose correctly," she said. "Which choice?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "The one you made before any of this," she said. "When you walked into a lodge in the rain and asked for the cheapest room." She left. He stood at the window of the council chamber for a while after. The power does not leave a room when the crisis passes. It redistributes. It settles into new configurations, new relationships between weight and support, new places where the load is carried, and new questions about whether the structure will hold. An empire, like any building, is not completed. It is perpetually under maintenance by whoever has chosen to remain inside it and care about the quality of its walls. Draven Morvane was not the same king who had ridden away from Moonspire in the rain. The man who left had believed that power was the natural territory of someone like him, that the throne was simply the correct home for a person built to fill it, that leadership was as much identity as choice. He had been good at it, which is not the same as understanding it. He had managed people without always fully seeing them. He had made decisions with genuine care for the people inside his empire, and had still managed to fail the specific people closest to him through the particular blindness that power generates in the people who carry it longest. The blindness of becoming so accustomed to having your presence shape a room that you stop checking whether the shaping is what the room needed. The man who came back understood something different. Strength is not the refusal to bend. Any material that cannot bend will eventually fracture. Strength is the ability to receive the full weight of what is real, the failure, the cost, the specific faces of the people you failed, without collapsing, without reconstructing the narrative to make yourself the hero of your own mistakes, and without passing the weight to someone else to carry so you can present clean hands to the world. He had bent. He had nearly fractured. He had been held, briefly and without ceremony, by a woman on neutral ground who had no reason to care what happened to him except that she was a person who decided what was worth caring for and honored that decision without drama. That was not a small thing. That was in some ways the most significant thing that had happened to him in 22 years of service. The council restructured over the following months. New appointments, commission-aligned and independent of the noble houses that had allowed themselves to be used as Varessa's political leverage. Aurel was offered a council seat and declined it in terms that were flattering to the council and clear about her preference, which was to remain in the east where the actual work was. Draven respected that more than he would have respected acceptance. The eastern border stabilized. The garrison reallocation was reversed. The exposed posts were reinforced by the third month. The Draven factions that had advanced into the soft positions retreated when the positions stopped being soft, because opportunistic aggression depends on opportunity, and opportunity is not a fixed condition. On the morning of the first spring thaw, Draven rode south. No court, no guards, no banners. The same as before, except nothing was the same. Ashen made the road quickly on ground that had softened enough to be forgiving and had not yet softened enough to be difficult. The corridor commission track was dry at the edges. The ridge showed the first tentative green of returning life in the tree line. Not committed yet, just suggesting. He came through the trees at midday. Ravenmere Lodge stood in the clearing with new timber on the stable's east wall and the same sign above the door, and smoke from the chimney and the specific quality of a building that has been deliberately maintained by someone who intends it to continue. He tied Ashen at the hitching post, not the east stable, which was still being rebuilt from the last section of the winter damage, and walked to the door. He did not knock. He had been told the lodge would be here. He had taken that at its word. He opened the door. She was at the counter. Not the ledger this time. She had a length of rope and was working a repair to the hitching ring hardware with the focused efficiency of a person in the middle of a task who intends to finish it. She heard the door and did not look up immediately. Then she looked up. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was going, the same 2 lamps, the same iron hook on the wall, the same coiled rope on its peg. The same woman who had looked at him on the first night with the carpenter's assessment and given him the finest room for the price of the poorest without explaining why. Storm clear, she said. Road's good, he said. A pause. I heard the inquiry concluded, she said, three days ago. She set down the rope. And the empire is not fixed, he said. It doesn't fix. It just gets maintained by whoever decides to stay inside it and care about the quality of its walls. She absorbed that. So you're back. I'm back. She looked at him for 3 full seconds with the direct, undecorated regard that had been the most honest thing in his world for the better part of a winter. Then she reached below the counter and produced a key on an iron ring. The same key. The same iron. She set it on the counter between them. Supper's at 7, she said, bread included. He picked up the key. He held it for a moment. This small, unimpressive, entirely ordinary object that was not a crown and not a scepter, and not any instrument of the power he had spent his adult life learning to carry. Just iron, shaped to open a specific door, offered by a specific person who had decided that the man standing at her counter was worth the offering. He understood what it was. Not forgiveness as an erasure of what had happened. None of it had been erased, and none of it should be. The exposed garrisons and the manufactured crisis, and the people who had been in harm's way because powerful people had treated them as variables. The devices in the stable. The woman who had walked across a yard in the dark toward a man in a shadow gap because she had calculated that it was the right instrument for the moment. These things had happened, and they lived in the record of what had been, and the record was not cleaned by a good ending. What the key was a beginning. Not the beginning of something that forgot what came before it. The beginning of something that knew exactly what came before it and chose to continue anyway. The specific kind of courage that does not announce itself as courage, because it is simply the honest decision of 2 people who have looked at the actual shape of each other, damage and all, and decided that what is real between them is worth the cost of tending. That kind of beginning was harder than any campaign he had run. It was also the only kind worth having. He put the key in his pocket. 7, he said. Don't be late, she said, and turned back to her rope repair with the ease of a woman returning to interrupted work, rather than delivering a final line. He went upstairs to the finest room in the lodge. He sat on the edge of the bed in the afternoon light and looked at his hands, the hands that had held a crown and set it down, that had held documentation of manufactured crisis and carried it through a ridge pass in the dark, that had steadied a deposed lord's rope bindings and offered their arm to a woman in a service corridor who had been, from the beginning, the most clear-sighted person in every room she occupied. He looked at the room. Stone walls, cedar-scented blankets, a window that looked out onto a yard where the new stable timber was still pale from the saw, not yet weathered to the color of the old. It would weather. Everything that lasted did. Outside, he could hear her below, the small sounds of a person moving through the honest work of a building they have chosen to tend, the fire and the rope and the ledger and the daily maintenance of a life that had been built by hand and was being kept by the same. I was not fixed either. He had come back carrying everything he had gone through, which is the only way anyone comes back from anything that actually happened to them. He was still a man who had misread the person closest to him until it was almost too late. He was still a man who had carried power long enough that he had to relearn the difference between managing people and seeing them. He was still a king, in the bone-deep structural sense, even without a crown, still built for the weight of things, still capable of the particular damage that capable people do when they stop questioning their own vision. He would make mistakes again. Different mistakes, perhaps, but mistakes. The goal was not to become someone who did not make mistakes. The goal was to become someone who did not make the same mistake twice, who did not construct narratives to avoid seeing clearly what had gone wrong, who did not pass the cost of their blindness to the people around them and call it the price of leadership. That was the work. Not the campaigns, not the councils, not the architecture of empire and its maintenance. The daily, undramatic, unglamorous work of being a person who could be trusted with what mattered. Supper was at 7. He was not late. He came down the stairs at 6:55 and sat at the long table, and she brought bread and meat and something hot that was not coffee and not bark brew, but something she had been working on that fell between them. And she sat across from him, and outside the windows of Ravenmere Lodge, the first spring dark settled over the neutral corridor with the specific quality of a darkness that has nothing in it to be afraid of. They ate. They talked, the way people talk when they are not performing conversation, but simply thinking aloud in the company of someone whose thinking they trust. And later, when the fire had burned down to the stage it needed tending, she stood and reached for the iron tool, and he was already across the room with a log from the stack. And they managed the fire together in the easy coordination of people who have begun to understand each other's rhythms without requiring them to be announced. The fire caught. The lodge held its warmth. And the crown, wherever it sat in Moonspire's rearranged council chamber, had finally learned the lesson that crowns almost never learn in time. That the power it conferred was only as honest as the person who carried it, and that the person was only as honest as the things they were willing to see clearly about themselves, and that the things worth seeing clearly were almost never the ones that looked good in the light. They were the ones you saw in a quiet room at 7 in the evening, with bread on the table and fire in the hearth, and a woman across from you who handed you the truth when you needed it, and asked nothing for it except that you do the same. That was the price of a crown. That was also its only redemption.